Good morning and a warm welcome to the second meeting of the Constitution Europe External Affairs and Culture Committee in 2026. Our first agenda item today is to continue taking evidence on Scottish broadcasting, and our first panel we are joined by David Smith, Director of Screen Scotland. Warm welcome. Paul McManus, Scotland Negotiations Officer for BECTU, and Emily Oyama, Director of Policy, Producers Alliance for Cinema and Television, and a warm welcome to you all. If I could open with a kind of broad question about just how do you feel the state of broadcasting in Scotland is at the moment, and I'll maybe go to Mr Smith first. Thanks.
Okay, thank you again for inviting us today and for having this inquiry into this subject. I know it was we're late in this Parliament, but it's a really important subject and one I hope will carry forward into the next Parliament as well. So we can't divide broadcasting and production. They're two sides of the same coin. And when we as an agency think about the health of the sector, we're probably more focused on the production side than the broadcasting side, but you can't separate them. And the demand from the broadcasters drives the health of the production sector. So I used to have this speech where I talked about how film and TV are not the same thing and explained how they differ. Television is not the same thing anymore. There's lots of different sides to it, and I think the health is variable is the simple answer. So some aspects are doing really well. If you think about high-end television drama production, both driven by the public service broadcasters and inward investment, it's very healthy. It's probably the healthiest it's been in Scotland in 20 years. But if you look at the unscripted side, the documentary side, the demand has more or less collapsed in many genres. So that's meant lots of companies are really struggling, lots of freelance workers are really struggling. So things are variable is the short answer. As a general trend, the economic impact of the sector has continued to grow. That's driven in large part by high-end TV drama and film production, more high-end TV drama, to be honest. So we are confident that it remains a continuing a sector that will continue to grow across the next decade. There's every evidence that people will continue to watch in large numbers fantastic shows like Traitors and Department Q and everything else. But it's going to be a variable picture, and the move away from a linear delivery on broadcast to a non-linear delivery on platforms means that audience patterns have just changed, and you've seen genres. I spent most of my career working in television in specialist factual arts and science and history production. That's podcasts now, that's YouTube now. There's been a complete change of direction driven by audience practice, driven by the move away from a linear schedule.
I wonder if I could stick down on that, because you talked about documentaries, but there is a huge uptake in true crime kind of broadcasting and podcasting as well around that kind of area. Where's the line with that? When does it become documentary? When does it become entertainment drama, if you like? That's a difficult question with a moving set of goalposts, I would say. I was joking with somebody yesterday that if you want to make factual TV now, you've got to focus either on air fryers or murder. You can do consumer products or you can do serious crime. I'm not sure that's entirely true, but the line between factual entertainment and factual and documentary is blurred. Documentary, I would say, is a specific genre, though. It's one where I cut my teeth over a number of years. Mm-hmm. That's not migrated necessarily to YouTube alone. Theatrical documentaries enjoying a really kind of positive period in Scotland. We have, as an agency, we have 5 funded films in Sundance later this month. 3 of them are documentaries from Scotland. Okay, thank you. Mr McManus.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you for the invite along today. To be honest, I would echo a lot of what David is saying in terms of film and TV production, but in terms of the broadcasting, where broadcasting's at, there are a number of significant challenges facing the industry in Scotland just now, not least of which is the already discussed STV's downgrading of its news output. BBC faces significant challenges over its charter renewal. It's had many years of cutbacks and poor licence fee settlements, ongoing year-on-year redundancies, and it's really, really important that this government and other bodies stand up to support the BBC to defend its impartiality in the wake of all the disinformation that's flying about out there. It's essential, it's crucial for the culture and democracy of Scotland that we have a strong, independent, impartial BBC that's free from political interference, and that the services that they provide, or it provides, are universal to all. Without that, we start to undermine the culture and the democracy of the country if people don't have universal access to high quality to broadcasting. The one area where I would say is a challenge for us in terms of film and TV production, out with what David has said, is in terms of the government's fair work policies. The industry in Scotland is miles behind other sectors in terms of fair work, as we see more and more companies investigating, researching and moving towards a 4-day week. Our members would love to get away from a 6 or 7 day week, never mind a 4-day week. So there's a huge amount of work to be done there. I'm not saying it's any worse than other parts of the industry elsewhere in the UK, but it's certainly worse than other sectors in Scotland, and it's, fair work is something that this government needs to ensure is manifested robustly across the film and TV industries.
Thank you. Ms Oyama?
Thank you, Convener, and members of the committee. Thank you for inviting me to give evidence today. Likewise, as Paul mentioned, and David, I concur with what they sort of laid out there. I would sort of go a bit further, though, to say there are significant challenges within the broadcasting sector, and of the 800 members that we represent, 55 of those are within the Glasgow area, which make up, as you are well aware, a screen cluster within Scotland. And the majority of those members are within that unscripted genre. And I think they are really having a torrid time at the moment. And PSB and public service broadcasting is the linchpin, really, in terms of the commissioning opportunities that they've enjoyed over the last many decades. And I think going forward, if we want to continue sustaining the incredible inward investment that we're getting, we need to make sure that the domestic production is sustained, because that's where the skills pipeline feeds into those. That's what attracts Scotland as a hub, and I think we're significantly worried about what the future holds.
BBC Charter has already been mentioned in the framework renewal process. What would you think should be the priorities for Scotland within that?
Well, definitely in terms of the BBC licence fee, we are a big supporter of that. It very much underpins the funding within a lot of the nations and regions. So protection of that BBC licence fee is crucial, I think.
Ms McManus, of the Charter renewal, have you anything else that would be a priority? Yeah.
Oh, well, the licence fee settlement, a realistic licence fee settlement that allows the BBC to expand its programme making, because BBC Scotland has lost a lot of capacity for programme making over the past 10-15 years. Much of the product you see coming that's attributed to BBC Scotland is commissioned through BBC Studios, which is a UK-wide subsidiary. You know, production companies, as Emily's talked about, struggle with commissioning tariffs. This is an issue we come up against time and time again. If the BBC, even if it commissions programmes, people struggle with the commissioning tariffs that are offered, which results in some of the pressures in terms of longer hours, lower rates of pay, and unrealistic demands on the crews and the producers and the production companies. But again, there are some positive signs, I think, as I said in our submission. The way the BBC is changing its commissioning process and its commitments to out of London would offer some degree of optimism that hopefully, particularly in the unscripted areas, we'll start to see more products for Scottish-based production companies and crews. And I know, Screen Scotland's involved in the BBC with some of that work.
Okay, Mr Smith, do you want to add anything?
I think that the principle of universality in terms of how the BBC is paid for is vital, is one of our views. Beyond that, how the BBC is funded, our main point is it should be well funded. It's suffered 2 charter periods of decreased funding, and that's impacted the sector as a whole, and that impacts the UK's competitive ability in the kind of international markets. Successes come from independent production companies and broadcasters in combination, and it's that kind of combination of intellectual endeavour and creative endeavour that delivers those products that we then think about as being kind of representative of UK broadcasting. But if the BBC is constrained in its ability to spend, that impacts our competitiveness, it impacts our company's sustainability. I think the argument, we would always argue for a well-funded BBC, but we'd also argue for a BBC that then spends that money kind of evenly and fairly and equitably across all 4 home nations. And I think there are concerns we may get to across this session around how the BBC has spent its money in the last charter period, the current Ofcom regime that determines what qualifies as Scottish and what doesn't qualify as Scottish, and then a kind of more fundamental point for us, which is the BBC's own view of how it delivers against its public purposes. Is it happy to meet the letter of certain criteria rather than actually delivering against their spirit?
Okay, I'm going to move to questions from the committee. I'll come to Mr Halco Johnson first.
Thank you very much, Convener. Morning to the panel. Just sticking on what we've just been talking about there with regards to the BBC. You all support universality and obviously the need for kind of funding. Do you kind of recognise, and I'll be interested to hear your thoughts on the kind of public concerns or wide public concerns about perhaps the how BBC spends money in terms of its administration, its managerial, that there are perhaps too many people on very high salaries within the BBC. Do you think there needs to be that sort of change for some of the public trust in the use of the funds to be, I suppose, restored? If I can maybe come to you first, Emily.
I mean, I think we've always been of the opinion that we want to see as much of that funding go into content, and so we're always of the opinion that as far as possible we need to see efficiencies within the BBC. We always think about we're not entirely convinced about the people that spend the money, but we are very much in favour of that money going as much as possible into content. And as you say, of the is it 5 billion, 4 billion that the BBC contribute, I think it's only 1.2 billion or so that goes into content, and so there's got to be room for manoeuvre there. Would
you say, because I mean, certainly certain experiences I've had with the BBC over the years, there is, while there's a lot of talk about there not being the funding and the requirement for more funding, there's quite a lot of wastage. And from particularly your sector as an independent sector, I don't imagine money is something that's flowing. So you'd want to see that used. I mean, do you recognise that perhaps that it is a question about how better to use some of that money rather than always... I think there is that. It may be, are there duplications happening where they're doubling up in terms of within the market? That's definitely something. Middle management, something to think about. I know that when obviously when they spun out to create BBC Studios, a lot of investment went into that, and obviously we want to see BBC Studios succeed. But I noticed in the last year, I think recruitment into BBC commercial arm did increase, I think, last year compared to BBC Public Service. So you've got to look into, is that an efficient way of spending that budget rather than spending it towards content spend that could be spread across the nations and regions, including Scotland? Thank you. Paul.
Thanks. Big2's never slow to criticise the BBC where we see what we perceive as waste. That said, within BBC Scotland, I'm not seeing a disproportionate amount of money being spent on administration services. There are times we struggle to find managers to deal with issues these days. So I don't recognise that as a serious issue within BBC Scotland. I think they have improved dramatically over the past 10 years in terms of their structures and their processes. Where we have seen big cuts is in the programme making ability within BBC Scotland. And, and I mentioned BBC Studios earlier on. BBC Studios is a commercial venture. So, however many managers they choose to employ, they've got to balance that against their financial results at the end of the year. Within the public service broadcasting, the huge majority of programme making capacity was taken away from BBC Scotland and put into the commercial side of things. So I don't see huge amounts of money being wasted in administrative processes within BBC Scotland, not at all.
I suppose, I should say for the record, as somebody who comes from the Highlands and Islands and from an island community, I very much value the BBC, particularly on the radio side, and I say that because I was on them again this morning, so I shouldn't criticise in any way. But, I suppose it's that perception that perhaps some of the things that we all laughed at in W1A, which was one of the best comedies on the BBC, is possibly more accurate at the higher levels of that kind of administration there. David?
I could watch W1A on the basis that it felt too close to home at times.
Yeah.
I think the BBC's gone through, again, two charter periods of reduced income from the licence fee in real terms. And that's driven a lot of cost cutting and reduction in headcount. I would agree with Paul. I think I look at the BBC now as in Glasgow as opposed to 20 years ago, and there are far fewer people there than there were once. I also think it's an interesting position to be in if you're in the upper echelons of the BBC, and that you're in this Venn diagram between a highly competitive global commercial enterprise and a public service broadcaster. And we've seen lots of very senior people leave the BBC recently for jobs in the commercial sector. So there's genuine competition there for those roles. If you're not able to offer a salary that will attract people of ability, then the BBC's at a disadvantage, and we want the BBC to be strong. So it's not a simple answer, but I think there have been lots of cost cutting. I think it is necessary to pay people salaries that will attract them into the roles that are significant.
Okay. I'm conscious of time, so I'll just go to a couple of other points as well, if I may. Emily, you talked about the kind of, I suppose, confidence in the sector in some of the areas, and I think it was probably in a little bit of contrast to what David was saying, and I was just wondering, I mean, do you think for the independent companies particularly there is a concern for the future, and why is that, and I suppose what needs to be done to bring that confidence back?
Yeah, so I think just going into a bit of detail on that, last year we commissioned a report looking into the changing nature of UK content and how that's impacting the diversity of supply, and we found that there was because of the delicate structural changes that are happening on the PSB side in terms of reduced ad spend, declining BBC licence fee, they're obviously having to pivot towards different commissioning strategies, and that those new commissioning strategies are pivoting towards fewer, bigger, better commissions, and inevitably that's polarising the commissions that are happening, and so you're getting the high-end drama and peak entertainment offers happening those are the kinds of opportunities that are being put out there, and the sort of long-running returning series that we used to see that benefited the sort of smaller to mid-sized producers running away from us as an industry. And that report basically found that the middle is being hollowed out, and I don't think Scotland is immune to that. And the members that make up the Glasgow Screen Cluster tend to focus on unscripted, factual entertainment programming, and some of those programmes that are still successful to this day, that are made by Scottish production companies. One of our members, Raise the Roof, for example, who make Love It or List It, for example. That same company, if they were starting out now, I don't think they would have the same opportunities to continue creating that kind of programming. And I think that's the worry. The worry is that we're not going to, in the next 10, 15 years, that same company is not going to have, let's say I set up my own production company tomorrow, I wouldn't have the same opportunities that Raise the Roof had 20 odd years ago when they sort of started off. And I think that's the worry that we have.
I know it was a very kind of noticeable time of year, a particular time of year, and we've all changed. We don't all crowd around the television to watch the same sort of programmes at Christmas that we might have done before. But it was very noticeable how many people were critical this year of what was being broadcast, the amount of repeats. There didn't seem to be a huge amount of originality. And then the viewing figures were obviously a lot less, and I wonder whether that's just a sign of how things are going to go, or whether that is reflected with just a lot more repeats because it's easier and cheaper to put stuff up. David, I don't know if you've got anything you want to just...
I think the key word in what Emily said was opportunities. It's a supply and demand market. The broadcasters have to be looking to commission programmes, and we're at a moment where charter renewals, the Green Paper's been published. It gives us an opportunity as a nation to ask what are our public service broadcasters for? There are, to say, when I said earlier that there's been a migration of kind of various genres onto YouTube or podcasts, that's true, but there still remains very strong audiences for all of those genres on television. And it's then a question of, are the broadcasters serving those audiences and commissioning the programmes that meet their expectations? So I spent 20 years working in independent production. I ran an independent production company before I took on this job, and I was also national director of PACT in Scotland immediately prior to taking on this job. So the health of the independent sector is really important to Screen Scotland. And we do have a number of funds that are targeted directly at their ability to win new business. The question then is there a market for that business? And that's really been at the heart of a lot of our research that we published over the last couple of years. The O&O report, which we sent in as one of the papers, which showed that there is a UK-wide single Ofcom regime in terms of how programmes qualify as Scottish. How the BBC and how Channel 4 approach that regime is quite different. Channel 4 tends to look to Scotland-based production companies to meet their Scottish qualifying output requirements. The BBC has tended, especially in returning series and long-running series, to look to London-based companies to meet that requirement and then qualify those programmes as Scottish through the Ofcom process. We like a mixed economy. A mixed economy is healthy. A mixed economy is good. It means that if demand falls in one part, you're sustained in other parts. But the reliance on too much inward investment within the UK market by the BBC to meet that Scottish quota has been a concern for us, and we would like to see a rebalancing of that. I think there's an opportunity here. The BBC have changed their rules a little bit. They've diverted from what Ofcom have set as criteria. They've moved the bar so that, I can't remember the exact wording that they use, but they will tend towards commissioning only programmes that will qualify as Scottish on the basis of a substantive base and meeting the 70% spend test. We think that's really welcome, but it's actually not answering the question that we've been asking for the last 5 years, which is please look to the Scottish-based suppliers to deliver that output.
Can I just comment on that as well? Because when we talk about Scottish-based suppliers, this is a big country, and a huge amount of the very successful programmes recently, or the ones certainly that get the attention, Outlander, Traitors, Shetland, aren't based in the Central Belt. But do you think there's enough of the support side, the production companies, etc., based out with the Central Belt? Because this is always an issue for areas like mine, the Highlands and Islands, that we're a wonderful filming location, but there's enough being done to base companies and people out there. If you are creative or you're a lawyer dealing with IP or whatever you happen to be within that, is there enough happening out with the Central Belt in those communities?
So I'm from Inverness originally and moved to Edinburgh and Glasgow to kind of start my career. I think that still remains how most people will likely have to start their careers. There are individual productions. We obviously work very closely with Judy Lambert and the BBC on Traitors, which is shot up in Ardross. We work with them to invest in training opportunities in that project. You focus on your question on the one where productions are filmed, the location of the filming. Our concern is more about the base of the company. So yes, they are predominantly in Scotland and Glasgow. 90% of, I would say, our production companies are based in Glasgow. All of our broadcasters are based in Glasgow. That's a function of history. That's an outcome of history of Scottish broadcasting. It's very hard to kind of change that because there are real cost implications. Unless a production is based somewhere and hires locally, you have to pay overnights, you have to pay various costs to complete that project. So to reduce costs, we tend to cluster production into various parts of the UK: Belfast, Glasgow, Bristol, Birmingham, Salford. So you've got forces that drive all of that. But my point isn't so much about where these things are filmed, it's where that intellectual property is owned, where those backroom office jobs that you mentioned, the lawyers, the accountants, the heads of HR are based. And if those are based within Scotland-based production companies that win that Scottish qualifying output, they will tend to employ more people locally.
You want to add? Yeah, Paul.
Yeah, in terms of the basis that David was talking about, so you do want the mixed economy, and I think the BBC could do a lot more to be a lot more transparent. In any discussions we've ever had with the BBC, particularly about the likes of traitors and the fact that the crew was largely imported from down south. When you talk to BBC Scotland, break back at day one, it's a London Commission. It was nothing to do with us. We didn't put any money into it. We didn't ask for this programme. London commissioned it. They just happened to base it in Scotland. Now, that you're always going to get that kind of thing. With the Avengers series parachuting in a couple of years ago, they picked Scotland for the location. And we weren't jumping up and down saying, there's a problem here about importing work into Scotland. The problem is, as David says, when they try and pass it off as Scottish product, and you say, none of the crew are from Scotland. Lambert doesn't have a significant base in Scotland, and most of the money's going back down south. So, I think one of the things we are pleased to see is that, BBC Scotland, their commissioning teams are working much more closely together with each of the genre commissioning teams across the UK, and they're currently working with a group of Scottish-based companies to try and develop them so that they can produce more programmes, new programmes in areas like comedy and entertainment. The challenge for the BBC, again, is in unscripted areas, audiences are notoriously fickle. So the BBC would like to commission, perhaps 2 or 3 series of a comedy show or an entertainment show, which allows the Scottish-based production companies to develop their expertise and invest more in areas like training and build relationships with the broadcasters. But it's a huge gamble for the likes of the BBC to commission 2 or 3 series, So they tend to do it on a year-by-year basis. You mentioned the likes of, Shetland. We see programmes coming back year after year, but they won't commission them for a number of years because they're so concerned about the audience habits changing. They are doing a lot of work in terms of YouTube and online platforms to try and develop that side of the industry as well. So I'd say that there are some more positive signs I'm seeing in terms of output, particularly in unscripted, but it's got a long, long way to go because the unscripted side of it, as Emily said, David has said, is just, is just dire, and it has been for the past couple of years.
I did not get onto the whole how many Shetland voices or accents are there in the Shetland series because it's something that comes up. And just very quickly, and that's my last point, Emily, I don't know if there's you want to add to that in terms of the not just within Scotland but out within the regions opportunities.
Yeah, I mean, we obviously are of the opinion that the best way to grow the sector in Scotland and across sort of nations and regions is via the production quotas, the regional production quotas, and actually, I guess going back to your previous question about what are the solutions, I think we would say is that the current framework that we have that has fostered the diversity within the supply chain is sacred, and we need to retain that. And there is a risk that some of that gets unravelled in the next few years, and I would urge the committee to very much look at that framework, which includes terms of trade, the regional production quotas, BBC licence fee, origination quotas, that those 4 things basically enable the diversity of supply, and we think in terms of regional production quotas they give they're flexible enough to allow for innovation to happen, and I think that sometimes we think sub-quota or sub-definitions that are added on to the quota could stifle innovation, and that's something that we're a bit wary of.
Okay, I'll hand back to Convener. Thank you.
Mr Harvey.
Thank you, Convener. Good morning, everybody. I've got a couple of questions on charter renewal and then one more general. And the first one was going to be on this issue of quotas and criteria. So we've covered some of this ground already. But the Green Paper does seem to indicate that the government's open to change in this area. And I wonder whether we have any prospect of seeing the various voices from within Scotland alight on a kind of consensus about what changes specifically would be beneficial. Because of the comments that have been made and some of the written submissions that we've had, there seem to be quite a number of people suggesting that change is necessary, but not necessarily agreeing what that change ought to be. So can I ask you, first of all, in principle, do you think there's the potential for some consensus? I don't just mean consensus here on the committee in our report, but within the industry about what changes to the quotas and criteria would be beneficial? Or is there too diverse a view? And in particular, I recognise that a great deal of it needs to be about the economics of the industry, as David was saying, about skills, about where IP is owned and so on. Is there a role, not instead of, but as well as, for some element of a criterion around the audience perception of what's being produced, about whether a production feels of or about Scotland in terms of the audience experience of watching the productions that are made here?
So I've always thought that representation, your second point of your question, is really important and a trap. So yes, we absolutely want to see Scottish subjects, Scottish voices, Scottish places, Scottish people on our UK-wide screens. And I've said in my submission that the lack of any kind of quota on the Channel 3 licensees remains a concern for us, because there is a distinct audience that watches commercial television that isn't necessarily watching the BBC or Channel 4 and don't necessarily see that element of representation. So yeah, we'd be keen to see more of that. At the same point, from a creative perspective, if you're only, as a Scottish producer, required to make things that represent Scotland, you're restricted. So, I made a lot of documentaries over time. I always remember whenever I pitched up to see, let's say, the BBC Head of Arts, we would say, we've got this fantastic idea, we've got access to the Rijksmuseum, we're going to make a three-part documentary series about Rembrandt, his whole history using the existing text, all of that. And they would say, yeah, maybe Walter Scott. It's like, well, why am I restricted to only making subjects about Scotland? Whereas people in London are omnivorous, they can graze where they want to graze. So it's really important. Representation is vital. We want to see ourselves on screen. We want to see programmes that mean something to us on the UK-wide screen. I think from a UK cohesion point of view, that's very important. But it's a trap as well. We shouldn't be restricted to it. So that's the second part of your question.
And on the issue of whether there's the potential for consensus within the industry about what changes would be beneficial, or is the view too diverse for that?
I don't think it's too diverse, but I think it's much more diverse than it was once upon a time. I think we have a much more diverse sector than we had previously. Some companies very much target Channel 4, some target the BBC, some target beyond those to the international platforms. So it's a healthier sector than it was 20 years ago, but it's also a much more diverse sector. Bringing people together around the Charter is always quite difficult because it's kind of dry, but there are elements of it that are really important. And the BBC's public purpose, I think it's currently number 4, around contributing to the creative economies of all parts of the UK. That's the part around which we will be trying to convene people and get people to really think about what that means, because across the last Charter for the BBC, that's meant production in Scotland, so location filming, elements of production on projects that qualify as Scottish in Scotland. We would like to see much more creative origination from within Scotland. So that goes to representation, that goes to that kind of diversity of voice.
Any other views on this?
I think, as David said, it's a really diverse industry. The primary focus, for us is to get the BBC through the Charter renewal process in one piece, maintaining the licence fee with a proper sentiment, and to focus on the challenges, the political challenges it faces, because that, to us, is the kind of main challenge facing the BBC within Scotland. I think the BBC is heading in the right direction. It's got a lot more work to do in that, in terms of production. I think in terms of quotas, we want to see Scotland get its fair share of work. We want to see its fair share of work originating from within Scotland, and there are historical challenges within there. When you talk about the big entertainment show formats, some of which are filmed in Scotland. Pacific Key's been fairly successful at that in recent years. We're constantly getting complaints from members saying, yeah, but the designers are always brought up from London. Well, all the big game shows were always done in London, and that's where the expertise in designing them came from. And that's, you know, that's where we have to dig down into the specifics to say, right, what skills development, what training, what, you know, conversations can we have to make sure that designers in Scotland are getting the opportunity to work in these shows, so that over time they can then get the work for designing them. So it's extremely complex, and you know, it's too simplistic to sit there and say, right, well, a company's come up from London and Scotland, you know, and that's a problem when you find out, right, well, the company's from London, but the whole crew's from Scotland. You know, then again, you've got a Scottish-based company getting a commission, and they're using people from London. So part of our role is to dig down into the detail of that and identify the specific challenges and see, right, you know, there might be a fair quota, but we need to make sure that it's fair all the way through the process, that the creatives are getting the opportunity to work on it or produce it, and the you know, the off-screen talent are getting to work on it. So I don't think that's a straightforward answer about your question about an aligning of views over charter renewal. For us, the focus very much just now is on, you know, saving the BBC as a non-political, impartial broadcaster. That's the key priority.
I was going to come on to politicisation in a moment, but I just wonder if Emily Oyama has anything to add.
I mean, I think from our viewpoint, I think there needs to be a coming together of the current BBC quotas and making sure there's no weakening of the sort of quotas around nations and regions, because that could be a risk, because I think all broadcasters are looking at their obligations for the next 10, 15 years, and they're thinking, can we afford these obligations, and can we be looking at changing them? And I think that's where us in the industry need to be very vocal about the importance of the nations and region quotas and the independent production quota as well.
Forgive me, I don't want to misinterpret. Am I hearing that you're saying that the issue here is more about the application of the quotas and criteria rather than changes to them?
Yeah.
Okay, thank you. The second question was about politicisation, and Paul, you started to talk about some of that. The Back to submission addresses the issue of politicised appointments to the BBC board. That's not the only aspect of the problem. You know, the BBC, I think, quite fairly can be accused of having been part of the mainstreaming and normalisation of far-right racist narratives, culture war narratives, stuff like that over the recent years. What changes within the Charter renewal do you think could help to address that, either in terms of removing political appointments that have been made in the past or changing the rules about how they're made in the future?
I think the key thing we're looking for is a recognition, you know, from the government that governments can't be involved in the process of, you know, appointing board members to the BBC. It's all driven from the board down. You know, there's been concerns about political appointments at Director General level as well. If there's a non-political board and it's left to them to appoint the Director General, then there is that sort of trickle-down effect that, you know, impartiality is there. I think the politicisation of the BBC affects our members as much as it does in many respects as our colleagues in, you know, from the journalism side of things. You hardly see the BBC putting out a story about any of the key topics, what's happening in America, Israel, etc., without, you know, at least a handful of groups coming in and saying the language they're using is not acceptable, or they're denying the problem, or you know, there is when you talk to news people in the BBC, they're almost paranoid about impartiality, for fear, and to me it's a fear of upsetting one side or the other, to put it in simple terms.
I'd like to suggest it's more a fear of upsetting one side than the other. I mean, if we look at the way that the phrase cancelled is thrown around by certain types of voices, while others are sacked or forced to resign for supporting Palestinian rights or transgender people or other aspects of equality and human rights, and their careers are ended with barely a murmur barely a reaction in the press or the reporting of the issue.
I think for us, this is why it's important that the BBC feels confident and is mandated to be impartial, to investigate. You know, David's talked about, you know, getting involved in documentaries over the, you know, past 20 years. I came into the industry in the days of Gus MacDonald and the sorts of investigative journalism they did, where they would shoot everybody down quite happily based on the facts that they had investigated, rather than parroting what somebody had said on social media 5 minutes ago. I think it's really important that we put the BBC in a position where it feels confident and empowered to investigate all the sorts of scenarios you're talking about and report it accurately, and to reflect what I think the majority of people, certainly in Scotland, feel about these situations.
Do I have time for one final question? Thanks. This is a slightly more general question, moving away from just the BBC and charter renewal towards, I think some of the comments right at the very start from David Smith about, you quite rightly drew the distinction between production and broadcasting. And then on the broadcasting side, you identified very clearly that there's this growth of the streamers and other online platforms, and that traditional broadcasting is only one element of delivery of those productions. How far is that going to go? Is there a clear sense within the industry? Is broadcasting, traditional broadcasting, going to remain with us? Or are we preparing for a world in which it disappears or almost disappears, and that pretty much everything is delivered through other platforms? Because that would require, I think, a much deeper reflection and rethink on regulation than is currently on the table.
I think it depends on how successful we are through the charter period. This is a moment, I mean, my colleagues talked about how it's really important to get the BBC through charter renewal and sustain the BBC. It is, but to what end? You have to ask in this moment. Charter renewal comes around every 10 years. There are voices suggesting that we extend that period. But the BBC only focuses on these questions at charter renewal. And I think it's really important that you remain at least a 10-year kind of cadence when it comes to that period of renewal. It's really important that we have a strong public service broadcasting sector in the UK. It's really important that we have a very strong BBC. I think that's a vital element of our whole economy.
The bigger factors here are technological change, take-up of technological change, as well as audience behaviour. Are those factors likely to drive traditional broadcasting to an ever smaller niche? Or do we think it's going to settle at a level?
So we seem to have reached a plateau in terms of the Scottish economy, where spend is roughly 50-50 between the public service broadcasters and inward investment productions, roughly. It's been fairly static since the pandemic boost. It's levelled out at that level. I think audience consumption patterns, though, are continuing to change. In my household, I know the first thing my kids put on is YouTube. And YouTube's on the TV. And I think the television, I can't remember if it's the YouTubeification of television or the televisionification of YouTube is going to continue. It's going to continue to change. And I suspect the element of viewing that is dedicated to the public service broadcasters will continue to reduce over time. That drives you back to the question of, why do we have them? What do we expect from them? What do we want from them? And from our perspective, then, economic contribution, economic growth within Scotland is vital. Creative origination from within Scotland remains very vital. And developing the audience for content from Scotland is vital. Those are the three things we look for. But underneath that, there's a whole lot of other outcomes. And just getting the BBC through charter renewal isn't enough. We really, at this moment, have an opportunity to ask, to what end? What outcomes do we seek? Why are we doing this?
Any other perspectives on this kind of long-term direction of travel?
Yes, I think from our perspective, certainly from my perspective, I would like to think there will always be a place for traditional broadcasting. When I talk to younger folk, which is an increasingly expanding group of people in my situation, and again, as David said, they'll sit in front of the television and watch YouTube or Netflix or whatever. I actually find that makes them more open to watching the BBC and public service broadcasting. If they're sat in their room on a smartphone or out and about with their pals and they're on their phone watching stuff, they're watching social media clips, they're watching, podcasts and things, they don't think, let's go and have a look and see what's in the BBC. But when they're sat in front of the TV, and doing a bit of scanning through, you see, all right, what's that in the BBC? So I think, in some ways, that has helped raise the profile of the BBC with younger people. But I think it's really important that the BBC, there has to be that standard there in terms of public service broadcasting. You know, I spend a lot of time, you know, saying to my kids, saying to other people, you know, when they tell me about the latest news story, that's all AI generated. Go and look at the BBC, go and look at STV. If you want to know what's happening in that particular subject, go and turn over to them and you'll get much more closer to the truth than you'll get with, you know, what somebody's made up in their bedroom. It's too easy for, you know, too easy for kids, younger people, to kind of accept what they see without that knowledge of, well, not everything out there is the truth, and there are people out there who are deliberately not telling the truth, you know. And I look to the likes of Finland, who do classes on fake news and social media awareness, and think, God, I wish that was mandatory everywhere.
Anything further?
I think everyone wants to see their lives reflected in the content that they watch, and I think that's the key thing about public service broadcasting, and that's the most important thing is to sustain that. And I think it then feeds into the diversity of supply, which I was talking about earlier. So I think going forward, making sure that public service broadcasters create storytelling that resonates with different age groups and different audiences is really important, and that might be going to where audiences are, and I know that there's been discussion about that. But yeah, I think it's important.
Thank you all.
I wonder if I could just ask a supplementary on the area we've been covering. Yeah, we're all getting older, and you know, the younger generation is kind of up behind us. But I heard a report on Radio 4 just in the last couple of weeks about how young people don't see themselves as consumers of the BBC. So they're less likely to pay the licence fee because they're paying for other streaming opportunities. Does that face challenges for the sustainability of the licence fee, or if a whole sort of demographic is just disengaging from the BBC and paying that as a matter of course? And David, do you want to come in?
I think the answer is obviously yes, but I think the onus then is on the BBC to meet that audience where they expect to find content. You know, thinking back, the BBC started radio, the BBC started television. The BBC didn't start YouTube, didn't start the internet delivery of video content, but the audience is there on TikTok and YouTube. And obviously the BBC is migrating, it's moving more of its content onto those platforms. But the answer is to be there, you know, to meet them where they are.
Okay.
I think it's really important on everybody, collectively, governments, you know, public bodies, to impress upon younger people the vital importance of having public service broadcasting in a traditional broadcasting format. Yes, as David says, they're getting great at moving on to the social media platforms and trying to go where the audiences are. But that ability comes from the starting point that they're a public service broadcaster, and there needs to be that bedrock that younger people can understand that, you know, public service broadcasting is vital. Without that, you're just into the wild west of make-believe, which has got significant and serious fundamental challenges for the culture and democracy of the country. So we all need to educate them to how important it is that public service broadcasting underpins everything that they watch.
Okay. Any comments, Emily?
No comments.
Okay. I'm going to move to Mr. Kerr. Thanks.
We talked a lot about, Emily, you talked about inward investment, but it appears to me that you also, all three of you, seem to have a concern about the nature of the inward investment, that basically money comes to Scotland so Scotland can be used as a backdrop. And some aspects of the creative landscape, you know, all the way through to the engineers and all the rest of it, is utilised. But you mentioned, David, IP ownership a few times. Is that how you define the success of Scottish broadcasting? That we're retaining IP? Because part of the problem is, in relation to inward investment, these things are all joined together, aren't they? is that we're selling this IP often to the highest bidder, who inevitably ends up being a Netflix.
I think, so you touch on so many different things there, all of which are really vital and important. So as a national screen agency, we operate the Screen Commission. So Scotland being used as a location has value. And we're really active in drawing those productions into Scotland. Whenever we do, you know, for example, if you've got Frankenstein, that was a Netflix production coming into Edinburgh and Glasgow and Aberdeen to film, we try and drive training opportunities, we try and drive crew engagement opportunities, we try and encourage employment within Scotland on those projects. But they are a travelling circus, they come and they go. That's their nature. Yeah, and they spend a lot of money in the economy, and Frankenstein will sit on that Netflix platform for decades, and Edinburgh and Glasgow will be represented on that programme for decades, and people will see that. That drives screen tourism. So there's value in that. Second parallel path then would be kind of our national broadcasters. That's where I think we look more for intellectual property ownership. Netflix doesn't allow its suppliers to retain IP. So they take the IP, most of the international platforms do. Pact ran a campaign 20 years ago, maybe 25 years ago now, worked with the governments in the UK, the Conservative government at the time, to deliver what became known as terms of trade, where independent production companies retain the IP and the content they deliver to the BBC and Channel 4, and they can sell that in international markets. This inquiry is about the health of the broadcasting sector. That was the fundamental move in terms of what kick-started the growth of the sector in the UK. Producers owning their IP, retaining their IP, the broadcasters taking a licence, but only for a limited period of time and a number of screenings. Then the producer can sell it again and again. And they own the IP and the underlying idea as well, and they can sell that idea. The health of the sector depends on IP ownership. That's why you see Disney buying Marvel, Disney buying, you know, all of these projects. The IP is what drives consumer attention. The IP is where the long-term value is. So
it's all about scale, isn't it? Money and scale.
IP in the long term, because that's what allows you to reinvest your income into new ideas, which deliver new business, which keep the cash flow going, which keeps your business open. It keeps going from there.
It can also be derived from the sale of IP to these giants.
Absolutely.
In the same way that you get feeder football clubs that,
Yeah.
you know, bring on some talent, sell it with all the contractual add-ons.
And we're seeing that more and more in secondary markets. So Still Game, for example, is massively successful on Netflix. The IP in that project remains held by the production companies in Glasgow. So your idea for that development clubs is really important. You don't tend to get commissioned by Netflix until you've been successful in the BBC or Channel 4. They are where you learn how to make programmes, where you develop your reputation. So having a viable market on those platforms, the BBC and Channel 4, gets you to that international opportunity.
So the dependence on the public service broadcasters of organisations like Netflix and Disney, you're highlighting that. But
I think Sorry, there's also the opportunity point that Emily made earlier. If you think about the number of projects that Netflix or Amazon or any of those platforms are commissioned from Scottish production companies, you can count them on the fingers of one or two hands. They're economically really impactful, but there are few of them. Compare that with the demand from the BBC and Channel 4. They remain the opportunity market for Scotland-based producers. That's where Scotland-based producers will tend to win business. That might lead ultimately to.
And hence, you all gravitate towards the idea of quotas so that there is a regional equity.
I think the tendency of UK broadcasters has not been to look beyond the M25 unless they're required to, because it's easier. It's a confidence game. If you do,
Massively the case, though, given everything else.
I think it's still.
And Channel 4 obviously have deliberately tried to.
Yeah. It's still the case. It's still the tendency. I think the mileage may vary. Let's say.
It has got better over time, obviously, since 2017, I think. I mean, in terms of
Salford in the Channel 4 decision to relocate outside of London.
and I think with the increased separate quotas for BBC that were set up, which we campaigned for, you have started to see a shift into the nations and regions, but you've still got about 60% of the revenue within our membership anyway is London-centric. But that's why the nations and region quotas are so vital to sort of sort that market failure within the system.
So Paul, this comes on to the point you made earlier, which I thought was a very important point, which deserves to be amplified. When you talked about how Scottish companies will often bring in people from down south because we don't have the people in Scotland to do, or don't appear to have the talent or resource on the ground in Scotland. I've spoken to a number of businesses. There are businesses in the broadcast field, and they always bring up the paucity of routes into the market for young or aspiring engineers, camera people. You know, is that a concern you've got? I think I tend to measure the health of a sector by the talent management approach that the sector has. I don't know if you agree with that, but it would appear to me that that is a problem in Scotland when it comes to broadcasting. We don't have many routes for young people or aspirant people to get into the sector.
We don't have a lot of routes in. I think the situation has got dramatically better. The routes that are there into the industry have got much better over the past 20 years. But again, I think back to the last session talking about STV's proposals. All the engineering talent is being removed from Aberdeen. Yeah. So if you live in Aberdeen, Inverness, the north of Scotland, and you're looking for a route in, you're following David's route, right, let's get down to the Central Belt, because that's the only chance I've got.
What's been put to me, and I'm just testing this with you, is what's been put to me is a lot of these people actually were trained by the BBC.
I don't think that's so true nowadays. The BBC still does a huge amount of training. They bring in apprentices every year. They're still the gold standard in many respects in terms of, the broadcast side of the industry. There are a huge number of people being churned out by colleges and universities in some kind of media courses, and I don't think the supply of people, I don't think their expectations are being managed because, in relation to, other sectors, it is a difficult industry to get into because there's not a lot of opportunity, and that's not helped by, if Scotland doesn't get its fair share of work coming up to Scottish production companies, they don't have the opportunity to offer training. If people aren't commissioning 2 or 3 series at a time, they don't have the ability to bring people in and train them to come into the industry.
Well, or they will, actually, because of the nature and complexity of having apprentices.
Yes.
Which has been put to me by business people who say, the administrative cost, the challenge of managing an apprenticeship, the way that we do it in Scotland, it puts them off. So they tend to take people... No?
No, absolutely not. I disagree with that fundamentally.
Right.
I think this goes back to the elements of fair work that I spoke about at the start. There are still people out there who think the route into the industry is to volunteer for 6 months and to work as a researcher or a runner for 6 months, getting no pay. And then if we get another commission in the future, maybe we can start to pay you. It's not about a lack of opportunity. And this is where the commissioning tariffs and the commissioning process is so important because, the BBC is looking at if we commission a company in Scotland to make work, can we build an element of training into that so that trainees are given an opportunity to get into that? Yeah. Again, as David was talking about in the likes of traders, can we talk to these companies? Can we pressure them to invest in training and give people routes into the industry or to develop their careers?
Apprenticeships, we're talking about.
But a lot of the times, people coming up from London, it's not about a lack of resources. Traders could have been totally crewed in Scotland. It's about the desire, the relationships people in London have, or people up here have, with people they've worked with before. So I'll bring my favourite director of photography up from London, rather than go looking for somebody I haven't worked with before in Scotland. That's more of an issue. But it's hard
to get into that. That's the point.
Oh yeah, absolutely, yes. It's extremely difficult.
Yeah, and the BBC has been the, I think you said gold standard way to get into this in the past. You've got BBC experience, BBC apprenticeship, BBC.
I would disagree with that to an
extent. Oh, please, good,
So, yes, once upon a time, and in certain areas still, the BBC apprenticeships are the gold standard. But we operate a project called Screen Nets, which it's 40 years plus in film and high-end TV drama production in Scotland. That's the gold standard for getting into the production crew. Apprenticeships don't really work within our sector in production terms because no production lasts long enough to sustain an apprenticeship. So ScreenNet acts as an employer for those trainees and moves them from production to production.
Right.
So you don't come out of it with an actual apprenticeship, but you've got work-based experience, you've got credits, and ultimately, at the end of the day, those are the two things that most people look for when they're hiring somebody.
But there
What
must
have
be
you
a
worked
way
on?
of organising that so people end up with some kind of recognised qualification
Well,
beyond
yes.
beyond experience
Well,
on the CV.
We're moving to that. So we introduced film and screen as a subject in the national curriculum this year. In September, it became the first new subject in Scotland's national curriculum in over a decade. The next stage for us is how does that move into further and higher education? How does that move into that bridge from there into work? We're
Because if you don't do that, you're going to stay with what Paul just described, which is so I should declare that my wife has a background in this sector, and that's exactly right. 6 months, no pay, just show willing, be enthusiastic, and you'll get someone will spot you and da 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 da. It doesn't work that way from nearly everybody.
I don't think it works. I don't think it works that way for most people. I've got to say.
No, probably not.
No, I mean, I think most
but
people.
It'll be one in 1,000, 1 in 10,000.
No, I reverse of what you think I'm meaning there. I don't think that's how most people join the sector. I think most people do join in paid roles. They may not join in well-paid roles, but they do join in paid roles. Yeah, every opportunity we deliver has to be Fair Work compliant.
All I'm saying is, for the sector to genuinely be healthy, I think there is agreement that looking at the way that we approach skill acquisition, qualification, how people progress in their careers, there needs to be some kind of a path that they can aspire to at least.
Agreed.
And at the minute, that's really not formed.
I think it's more formed than you might imagine it right now, and I think it's becoming more formed. When Screen Scotland formed, we spent roughly £400,000 a year on skills development. We now spend over £2 million a year with matched funding from industry, so projects like Department Q, Outlander, Traitors, it's work-based experience. ScreenNets is about to be re-advertised. There'll be 8 new training opportunities on that project. These are clear pathways that have sustained for a long time, but with each project that comes up in Scotland, we're in a really fortunate position now where I remember when Monarch of the Glen was the only drama in Scotland, and then there was a period where there wasn't much else. We've got multiple dramas returning, Shetland, Department Q, a whole host of them. They are vehicles to upskill people.
But the more recognisable the structure of that career
Agreed.
formation, the better for the sector.
Totally.
And we don't have that yet.
I think we have it to a greater extent than you might imagine, but yes.
All right, okay. So I'm glad you're challenging what I'm imagining. It's just on the basis of what people have said to me about how difficult it really is and how hard it is to actually show accreditation.
Yeah.
Is that not a fair point, Paul?
Yes, the accreditation part of it is really key from my point of view, and this goes all the way up to well, who runs training and skills in Scotland. We've got Screen Skills with a UK-wide perspective. We've got different things happening in Scotland, and I don't think there's a disagreement between David and I. I mean, the BBC's, in my view, is still the gold standard in terms of broadcasting jobs.
Yeah.
In terms of TV production, and I've said in my submission, Victory Vision has been instrumental with Screen Scotland and the BBC in changing the landscape about production skills, helping people to get into the industry, helping them to progress through the industry and to develop their skills. But that's still, you're having to create a situation where somebody says, I've been in the ScreenNets programme, I've been in the Victory Vision programme, and the producers go, I know what that means.
Yeah.
So I'm willing to employ you. They can't hold up a bit of paper and say, you can't even hold up a bit of paper and say, I'm a qualified electrician at the minute, because there is no single qualification. There are industry initiatives like the Rigger scheme, the GRIP scheme. We're now starting traineeships in the electrician scheme. We need, at that level, more strategy in terms of there has to be a bit of paper that says, I'm qualified to do this job, rather than, well, can I phone the mate you work for last time
and
see if
something
they're any
structured
good?
behind the bit of paper, which is the critical thing.
Yes, that's it.
Yeah, the bit of paper is representative of something that's far more structured and far more substantive than...
But there's a lot of work happening behind that bit of paper at the minute. You don't have the bit of paper, but as David says, there's a huge amount of work.
So there's more to be encouraged about,
Yes.
basically. David's encouraging me to cheer up a bit about...
We'll write to you. We'll outline all the skills activities that we're
I
involved in,
shall look forward
but
to
we'll also
seeing
invite you to sets so you can meet people in action.
And I'm always grateful to meet people that challenge my imagination. Thank you very much.
I was wondering if I could just ask about something that the committee was concerned about previously, was the decommissioning of River City, and it's about the skills and the permanent jobs that were a big concern at that time. And I just wondered has anything filled that gap at the moment, or is there any prospect of something filling that gap?
Not in terms of a continuing sort of permanent drama series like River City. The BBC announced 3 drama commissions last year, which they were at pains to say weren't designed to replace River City, but it demonstrated their commitment to offering similar levels or greater levels of work. You know, the BBC said, you know, late last year, it intends to double the amount of money it spends in the nations and regions. BBC Scotland are currently working on a number, more drama commissions. And we've been talking about making sure that the production process is kind of planned so that we don't end up with 4 dramas at the one time and none for the other 9 months of the year. So I think we're confident that overall there will be more employment opportunities for more people across the year than there was with River City being the excuse that, well, we've got River City, so we don't need to worry about any other dramas. And I'm not saying, the BBC were as black and white as that, but that was the concern that, well, we've got River City. So, I'm fortunate enough to remember the days before River City when there were regularly several dramas shooting in Scotland at the one time, and hopefully the commissions that are taking place just now and the ones that are slated hopefully to come through in the coming year will more than replace what's happened at River City, because again, River City, they were all BBC Studios employees and there was a very low number of permanent employees. There was a very large number of freelancers who'd worked for a great many years on it.
Yeah, I think it was about that skills development and the continuity of work and all those things that build a profile for someone in the industry that I was thinking about. But we'll move on and I'll bring in Keith Brown.
Thanks, Convener. Just first of all, a point about the Charter and the BBC. And we all feel, whether rightly or wrongly, a bit more invested in the BBC because of the nature of how it's funded, I suppose, and its longevity. And you mentioned about political interference and how that would be a bad thing. I'm just thinking the ways that political interference, or people might see it as, I think the Charter renewal's been a basis for political interference over a number of years. I think the licence fee undoubtedly has, and like the panel, and I think all the other panels that we've had, it's been unanimous that we all want to see a strong BBC and a licence fee, although I do agree that for young people in particular, the licence fee will be accepted if it's deemed to be of value and relevant to them, which is an important consideration. But I think that one of the issues that we have in terms of news, it's interesting, all the politicians here will have had their issues with the BBC, but very few have had an issue with STV. I could be wrong there, but it seems to me that STV doesn't seem to attract the same kind of political attention, and maybe that's not helped, because look at STV North and what's proposed there. I think the issue on the political side for the BBC in Scotland, it's more about what they don't cover than what they do cover. They seem to have an aversion to covering issues which are reserved impact on Scotland, as opposed to devolved. So, for example, and it's probably best to give an example, we have had ad nauseum documentaries about the ferries situation in Scotland and the 2 ferries. We had 2 aircraft carriers built in Scotland which attracted virtually no attention from the BBC in Scotland, which were more than 3 times over budget and massively over timescale, but no coverage of that. It dwarfed the cost of the ferries. And I've raised this individually with, going back as far as Gordon Brewer actually, and their response seems to be saying we can't get UK ministers to come on to answer these. So it's a question of, really interesting what you said about Finland and disinformation, and I've said to a previous panel that most of the politicians here will do talks to modern studies pupils at school, and they very often ask how do I know what to trust from what I see. But I think the issue is more to do with what they don't see and what they don't get to know about. So it seems to me that it's kind of pervasive. I mean, we had Mark Davey at our political... Is it Mark Davey, is that his name? Tim Davies, sorry, and he said that his door was regularly opened by 5 or 6 Labour and Tory people every week, berating him for whatever the content was. And that closeness in London is where often that agenda is driven. So it's also the case that Scotland loses out in not having as powerful a say in the agenda. And I'm talking in particular about news broadcasting just now. Just interested in any views on that, and what might help the BBC in terms of resisting continued political interference.
I think, from our perspective, I think the non-political mandate is the key to all. You know, if that gives the BBC the confidence to say, it doesn't matter to us who's in power. I think, you know, because that hasn't been in place, there is a concern that the BBC feels it has to bend towards the will of whoever is sort of holding the purse strings in the government in London at the time. You know, in terms of what they choose to cover, from Beck2's perspectives, one of the, I would call it a blessing I have had over my career here is that when we discuss things with the BBC, we do not stray into editorial control. We're nuts and bolts about jobs and pay and conditions. So I'm constantly reminding myself and my colleagues that we don't comment on editorial output. So that's, you know, that's for, to me, the role of this committee and this government is to challenge the BBC to say, you know, why are you always talking about ferries that nobody's interested in, but you don't tell about the disaster of the aircraft carriers?
In ferries, by the way. I'm not saying they're not interested in ferries. It's just
no, but you know there are. I get there's stories out there that have been done to death, and you know, it doesn't mean that because the BBC wants to be impartial, it doesn't stray from the truth at times, or it doesn't get things wrong at times. You know, so and the same with STV. This is the role for this committee. And you know, for the Scottish Government to hold the broadcasters account to make sure they are being impartial and fair-handed in their coverage.
So it's almost a strange argument for more political involvement, but this committee has been really fundamental in driving better outcomes across broadcasting in Scotland for the last 20 years, various forms of this committee. Looking forward, under charter renewal, I think we would like to argue for a greater level of governance that's devolved within the BBC across the nations, and a greater role for the parliaments in Wales, in Belfast, in Scotland, alongside the role of the committees and governments in Westminster. We were speaking yesterday with our colleagues in Northern Ireland Screen and Creative Wales. Creative Wales, this is kind of a sub-point, but Creative Wales told me they have a news reporter funded out of a publication in Caerphilly that essentially covers the Senate and then distributes those reports free for use across all publications in Wales. That's funded by the Welsh Government. So there are ways to drive that coverage, but on top of that there is the governance point. And I think we were quite concerned when we started to look at the Green Paper about the role of the Westminster Parliament in comparison to this Parliament or the parliaments in the other devolved nations. And in our evidence, we've kind of indicated that the CMS committee at Westminster has 11 members. All of them represent English constituencies. 10 out of the 11 represent constituencies in the southeast of England. That makes it very difficult for us to get purchase within that committee. We have no local representation there. It needs to be more of a devolved structure in terms of the parliamentary oversight, governmental oversight. But then separate to that, the BBC's own governance structure, once upon a time, included very strong committees in Scotland, in Wales and Northern Ireland that supported the members of the board that sat in London, and also supported the executives and challenged the executives in each of those areas. And I think we'd like to go back to a system where the BBC's governance is much more strongly devolved across all 4 nations.
I don't know if you want to come in Emily or not, Tom.
Nothing to say.
Can you go back to the idea of quotas then? And I have to say, and sort of mortify my children, I've never watched Traitors. Last night on my family WhatsApp, there was 32 different interactions about the latest episode. My kids and their partners are all obsessed by it, but I've never watched it. But you have to say, and I hear the objections about the fact that it was kind of imposed upon and now used by the BBC to justify what they do in Scotland, but it is hugely successful and I think being exported all over the shop. And also the point was made before about River City's finishing, as I understand it, which is another issue which this committee has discussed. If, and I'm not sure there's a huge deal of confidence that Ofcom will do the right thing in terms of holding the BBC to account in order to make sure there is more activity, Scottish-based activity in that. Is there a standard, an agreed standard that within the industry people would like to see the quotas in Scotland, like to see the quotas? Have they got a way of trying to define the quotas, or are they happy with the current definition that's used, as long as it's used well by the Channel 4, but not so much the BBC, if you know what I mean? Or is there a proposal which people in the industry would agree would serve Scotland well at all?
I think in terms of strict quotas, we kind of talked about the sort of 9% figure as being, you know, the percentage of population in Scotland versus the UK. Work should be distributed in that kind of basis. You know, I don't know if David will agree with that or not, but that was the sort of general sense over the years of, you know, it should be based on the head of population. We should get that level of work. And that's really the sort of the sort of basis that people have talked about in terms of Scottish-based work by companies based in Scotland using Scottish crews. I mean, the BBC, again, late last year in response to challenges from a great many people, has said they will go beyond the 3 key criteria. Going forward, they will make sure that, you know, the majority of the off-screen talent are based in Scotland, the 70% production spend and the substantive base. So it's early days yet to see whether they'll deliver on that commitment. So if they're talking about doubling the investment out with London and going beyond the Ofcom criteria, which I tend to agree with you, probably, you know, given the sort of light touch regulation we've got these days, doesn't make a lot of difference. It's more important to us that we hold the BBC to these commitments, which will benefit companies and crews in Scotland.
Just on that last point, it's my last question, and I've mentioned this before, and I'm not sure I'm getting the point across right, but first of all, to say that somebody else said earlier on that you can watch TV, I think it was the Vice Convener, and it looks like certainly over Christmas now, 57 channels and nothing on, in the words of the Bruce Springsteen song. You know, there's lots of channels and apparently diversity, although an awful lot of it repeats. Just trying to make sure, given the fact it's a global market and how dependent we are on, even if we're losing the IP for it, on people like Paramount, Disney and Netflix and so on, and how valuable they can be if they come and decide to do something in Scotland. Is it not a case, given that, especially in light of the River City closure, there'd be benefit, and it's probably most for Scottish Screen actually, but there'd be benefit from establishing a kind of base of, you know, engineers, production assistants, broadcasting people, writers and so on, a base which everybody contributes to, so that if those kind of footloose kind of multi-country companies want to do something, they've got all the expertise here, and they know they've got all the expertise already. Now, it would be difficult to arrange. It's a diverse organisation. It would require people to give up some control, but to have that, I mean, it's the way that Ireland would do it, I think. I'm not saying they do it in this context, but they do it in many other contexts. A kind of Team Scotland approach. So you've always got a bank of production assistants, director of photography, that kind of stuff. It's always there and available. And probably the BBC would be the biggest kind of part of that, but others could be part of that too. I don't know if I'm getting this point across well. Surely we want to sell ourselves in the best possible way to attract these other big productions if possible, and rather than, as has been suggested, if they do decide to come, and it's a very competitive market, then they'll bring their own people, they'll bring them from elsewhere. If they know they've got in Scotland top-class people, engineers, sound, all the rest of it, then would that not increase the attractiveness of Scotland to have that kind of Team Scotland approach? And maybe David would want to come back on that.
Question in all of that, and how those Ofcom quotas operate to deliver outcomes. is something I think we would like to see more thought around. I know that you're taking evidence from Ofcom later today. So the BBC Charter has public purposes that drive various elements. That's a government DCMS process. Ofcom's quotas are an Ofcom process that sits in parallel to all of that and is not part of charter renewal. We have long-standing concerns about the ability of any project to qualify as Scottish solely on the basis that it has a Scottish qualifying base. So the production company has a base here which could be an all singing, all dancing base with HR departments, legal departments, production departments, development departments, editing, all of that, or it could be a couple of people, one of whom's a production manager, one of whom's a development executive. That is a concern for us because the economic impact of productions isn't measured through that mechanism. It's measured through the 50% and the 70% tests, but you don't need to pass those in Scotland, provided you have a substantive base, and the other two are met elsewhere in the UK, outside of England, outside of London. That's an inherent problem for us. So a proportional allocation of the economic impact alongside qualification is something we'd like to see consideration of. There's also a very difficult question around what is and is not a Scottish production company. To our mind, a Scottish production company is one that's been formed within Scotland and is managed and controlled within Scotland. That sits separate to its ownership. So, for example, IWC Media, where I used to work, is owned by Banerjee, an international group. It remains a very much, Glasgow-focused, Glasgow-based production company. That's quite difficult for Ofcom to throw a criteria around, but there is something that could be measured there. So go back to that kind of mixed economy point we made earlier. We want to see a process where the BBC and Channel 4, and ideally the Channel 3 licensees, are required to spend a proportional share of their production expenditure, their commissioning budgets within Scotland, roughly connected to population share, as Paul said. But I would say that as a base minimum. You want to exceed that where you can. And then on top of that, you have a requirement that the balance of that commissioning, those Scottish qualifying productions, are from Scottish formed, Scottish managed, Scottish operated businesses, because that drives that IP ownership, that long-term value. That also then drives those skilled roles that you were talking about and how we use those to attract the bigger productions in from outside of the UK, because the PSB market is separate to this big international platform market. They're not driven by the same concerns as the BBC and Channel 4. They've got no political imperative to do anything in Scotland. They come here because we have a network of studios. We have fantastic crews already, and we're growing more of them. We have a great, diverse, built-in natural environment that acts as fantastic locations. And we're a really positive environment in which to work. So that's all part of Screen Scotland's role, is to attract those productions in. And a key element of that is that combination of we've got the studios, we've got the skilled workforce, we've got a positive attitude.
So just to say, though, that, in the first part of your answer there, I've mentioned at the committee before that, I don't know if you still do, but Canada had a thing whereby, whether it's radio or TV, you had to have a certain proportion of your output was Canadian, and that's because they were right next to the powerhouse that is the United States, and seemed to be accepted by everybody. And I think within that they also had French language kind of quotas as well, but I could be wrong. And the French as well are very good at this. I suppose my point would be, would hard quotas like that not be a good thing to do for Scotland? But just on the second part of your answer to my second question, am I taking it from that, and I'm more than willing to hear this, that there's no merit really in trying to put together a kind of offer which is inclusive of all the different interests in Scotland that can be marketed as an appeal? Because your point about we have the technicians and all that, the committee's previously heard on a different inquiry that that's under real threat because of River City, for example, the particular benefits of a soap, a long-running drama being lost. So, but am I right in saying you're not concerned about that? You think the offer we've got already is the right one?
No, I think there's always room for improvement. I think the loss of something like River City has an impact because it was. Returning Drama is unique in that it is all year-round work, or mostly all year-round work, that returns and has a continuous demand for new entrants. So it was a fantastic vehicle for new production. There is definitely a concern that it will have an impact, but we're working very closely with the BBC and Beck2 and others to deliver training opportunities around those new dramas from Scotland. So we mitigate that loss, but at the same point, we are, Paul, correct me if I'm wrong on this, but 15 years ago we had 1.5, maybe 2 full-on crews that could support 2 big productions continuously in parallel. I would say we're well above that now. 3, 4, 5 productions concurrently at the same time. There is a as you mentioned earlier, there is a concentration on the summer months which we'd like to address, and we're thinking about how our funding could work to drive more activity in the winter months. So we potentially might incentivise productions that film in Scotland across kind of November, December, January, February, March. I think at the moment we're looking at 2 or 3 productions in the early months of this year. We're up to double digits for most months across the summer. So there's a real pressure there on the crew in Scotland that does drive people in from elsewhere, even if it is a Scotland-based production. But it's, you know, that's why it's really important to have a mixed economy, a managed economy, one where you have an agency like Screen Scotland that has an overview.
Yeah, I think the model you're asking about wouldn't work. Because, again, you have to differentiate between broadcast skills and production skills, broadcast needs and production needs, you know, and River City was one particular type of production. That doesn't necessarily give you the skills to go and work in other types of production. It's the processes and the strategies in place behind that. Well, you know, the skills have developed and the numbers have developed over the past sort of 10, 20 years. And it's making sure that we have the agencies and the processes in place to deliver the skills that you're talking about and looking for. Equally, the broadcasters, the BBC, STV, they have that sort of facility, the buildings, and the technology, the logistics to drive forward the broadcasting skills that are needed. And the broadcasting skills needed to broadcast are not skills that you would need to make a production. There is some overlap, and a lot of the skills you're talking about, BBC doesn't have, STV doesn't have, because they're production skills. And, you know, the STV studios, the BBC studios would hire those skills on the freelance basis. So it's our job collectively, amongst others, to make sure those skills are available. And it has, probably got, 4 or 5 full crews available for drama productions at the minute. But there's always, again, timing's always an issue. I frequently get people, phoning up saying, they brought a team of electricians up from Manchester for this production. That should have gone to Scottish crews. And I said, right, so, well, were you available to do it? Well, no, if they could have held off a couple of weeks, we've got to finish this job off. This. That's not how the industry works, mate, So when I get complaints based on the fact that there aren't enough bodies available, there's too much work, I should say, yes, we'll all go on working to deliver more skills as we are, but it's a better complaint to have than there isn't any work up here. But there is still, going back to my bugbear, an issue about fair work, because yesterday I was sent an advert by a production company who want to pay, they're looking for a really experienced producer to do podcasts 5 days a week, and what they're offering is less than the national minimum wage. Before Christmas, I was sent an advert by a company up here who was offering somebody 6 months free training if you come and work for us for nothing. What a great way to get into the industry. I see lower-level football clubs, well, there's a couple of Premier League clubs in there, constantly offering free opportunities to get free training if you'll come and do our media and film our games, to go out on our subscription YouTube channels. So we can make money out of it, but we're not going to pay you anything. So, that's an element of the industry that can't be ignored. There's a lot of great things happening in the industry, and I'm really positive about the industry overall, but there's a lot of things needing addressed.
It's worth saying that those opportunities you pointed to there are not necessarily in broadcast, as we would describe it, public service broadcasting, and nor are they funded by Screen Scotland. Those are opportunities that sit in that broader commercial world.
Yes, absolutely.
To Neil and George, because we are over time now, but I do want to get your questions in, but I'll go to, if you could be concise, that would be helpful. Neil first, thanks.
So you mentioned fair work there. I was going to just raise it because I know you mentioned it in your submission, in your opening statement, Mr McManus. In terms of ensuring that fair work policies are robustly implemented and maintained at all levels, why do you think it is that fair work principles and policies are not being adhered to in the way that you would like them to? Is it a lack of education, lack of understanding, or perhaps even ignorance? And you also call on the Scottish Government to mandate agencies such as Creative Scotland, Screen Scotland, Event Scotland, Sport Scotland and local authorities to play a full and robust role in addressing the serious deficiencies in fair work created by the long hours, no complaints culture prevalent within the industry for too long now. What conversations have you had with the Scottish Government and the Cabinet Secretary about addressing those points? Can I also ask the panel more generally, just in the interest of time? We received evidence last year from Dr Lisa Kelly from the University of Glasgow on safety in Scotland's screen sector. She highlighted, talking about skills gaps, systematic skills gap in safety skills, and highlighted research that showed, amongst other things, that 3/4 of UK crew reported that their own safety or that of a colleague had been compromised at work. She recommends that safety should play a greater role in education training and that public funding should be tied to productions with a demonstrable culture of safety. And I'd be keen to hear the rest of the panel's thoughts on that, but perhaps start with Mr McManus on the fair point.
I think in terms of what we're looking for from public bodies, you know, Glasgow City Council at the minute is snowed under with a request to close off streets for film productions. I'd be surprised if at any stage in any of those conversations Glasgow City Council had ever said to any of these companies, are you adhering to the Scottish Government's fair workforce policies in terms of talking to unions, in terms of giving people an effective voice and opportunities, etc., etc. Sport Scotland, there's a huge range of sports trying to increase their media presence and their media profile. Sport Scotland funds a lot of them, Event Scotland funds a lot of them. And again, we've had conversations with Event Scotland about it, but you know, the likes of a Sport Scotland will never think, well, we've got to make sure there's fair work there because we're supporting this sport, which is trying to increase its media coverage, but you know, we're not interested in media, so why should we worry about people, you know, fair work opportunities, but the public's money and support is going into that. One of the interesting conversations we've had with Richard Walsh, I think it is, at the Scottish Government, the civil servant, one of the civil servants in the media's unit, was around local authority event entertainment licences. There are events, you know, that are given a licence by the local authorities. Ourselves and the other creative industry unions that have major concerns about, you know, how these licences are just handed out with no regard for the fact that the people applying for them have got a very poor track record in how they treat the workers in the industry. And the local authorities had always said there's nothing we can do, it's a tick box exercise. You know, if they meet the criteria, then we give them the licence. Richard's discussions with various departments in the Scottish Government and I understand the UK Government has actually highlighted that, well, actually, the local authorities have a great deal of control in setting and establishing the criteria for these licences. So there needs to be a further conversation with them about how they do that, so that they can take on board the, you know, the sort of fair work concerns raised by the, you know, ourselves, Equity, the Musicians Union. I think there was another part to your question, but
no, I think well, there was also the question about safety skills.
Safety skills. I have to say, I think most productions in Scotland generally have very good safety policies. Where we have concerns, and a lot of them use very highly reputable safety advisors to advise them on their productions. Where we get concerns about safety goes back to the culture that needs to change in the industry. You know, 5, 6, 7 days a week, 10, 12, 14 and more hours a day. That's a cultural change that needs to happen. Everybody needs to be on board for that. The government, you know, and that needs to be imposed and impressed upon the industry, because right now the industry, if you talk to pretty much any producer, any production company, well, that's the way the industry is. You know, if you go to the BBC and say, why are people working 12 hours a day in River City? You make it all year round. Well, that's just the way the industry is. How can you change that? There are 1 or 2 green shoots of a change in attitude. There are some companies out there who are trying to change the situation, but right now the industry standard is long hours, long days. They need to be given the freedom and the budgets by the commissioners to allow us to change that culture, to get them down to a sort of normal level of work that everybody else is based on. And we, you know, Big2 Vision produced the Timewise report, which showed that can be done without any significant increase in costs to companies. And the BBC, off the back of that, they're now looking at piloting a couple of shows based on shorter working hours.
We're saying that Timewise was a joint initiative between us. You know, we fully funded the Timewise work.
That's right, yes. Yes.
And we recognise that kind of working time is something that we'd like to see kind of improvement on, more flexibility around. But, you know, I would say that every project that we fund, every role that we fund is Fair Work compliant. Every project that comes into us for funding has to be aware of and sign a pro forma that shows they understand what Fair Work means in the Scottish context. And they all do, if they want to progress into a funded role with us.
I don't know if Emily, have you got a...
I think it also depends on the genre that is involved. I know that our members are in close negotiations with BEC2 and other unions about fair working hours, and I know that the drama members in particular have been setting particular policies around this. But if I may, I might write to the committee in terms of getting the detail on that.
Thank you.
Mr Adam.
The questions I was wanting to ask, I'm reminded of when we had sitting down there the Director General of the BBC, Tim Davie, saying that he wasn't gaming the system with traitors. And then when someone says that, I automatically think, so you're gaming the system then? You know, but when that made me think last night when I was trying to work out what I was going to ask, and I used BBC Wales comparison with BBC Scotland because I wanted to, well, I like Doctor Who. So I had something I could actually, a long-term drama that I could hang my hat on. And when I was looking at that, that's been there in Wales in 2005. What I didn't know was Casualty is actually produced from BBC Wales as well. And there's a new production, His Dark Materials, a co-production with HBO. But the interesting part for me is the drama investment BBC Wales receives is 8 to 12% of the network drama commissioning spend, as opposed to 3 to 4% of BBC Scotland. And that works out about 180 to 220 hours of drama annually for BBC Wales and 60 to 80 for BBC Scotland. And they complain about us actually getting treated a wee bit better. I don't know, they seem to be gaming the system quite well themselves here. But it's the same when it comes to factual and documentary. So what's going wrong with BBC Scotland and how do we change that?
Kind of resist the suggestion that there's something going wrong with BBC Scotland. I think the BBC is multiple different organisations that run kind of alongside each other. So the BBC in Scotland as a whole has commissioned more drama from Scotland and more drama in Scotland than it has previously. The three productions you referenced there are all owned by, sorry, Casualty isn't. Bad Wolf produced both His Dark Materials and Doctor Who. Bad Wolf are not a Welsh-based company. There's lots of production work there, but there's no IP ownership, there's no retention of profits, there's no retention of sales income. That flows back to Bad Wolf, who are based, I believe, in London and are part of Sony International.
They do have a major production facility in Wales as well.
They do, but that goes back to the point we were making about, so those projects will be Scottish qualifying, those hours will be Welsh qualifying, but they won't necessarily have delivered more than that production work. Now, production work's definitely got value, it's got a lot of value, and it's definitely something to be encouraged, but it's not the only factor. And, you know, I think there's a really interesting question around charter renewals. Yes, we want a proportionate share of what the BBC spends on content. But what is the thing that we're taking a proportionate share of? At the moment, it's BBC, it's network originations is where the quotas land. But should we be thinking about what the BBC spends on each of those genres, you know, across all of its outputs? Because there is a different way of cutting things that we haven't quite considered yet. Now, Wales is definitely doing very well when it comes to drama. I don't really recognise what you're saying in terms of factual, though. I think Scotland outperforms Wales when it comes to factual production. The difference is that Wales has S4C.
It's marginal, the difference. It's 5 to 6% BBC Network factual output from Wales and 3 to 4% for BBC Scotland.
Speaking to Welsh colleagues, though, there's a general, pervasive and continuing concern that those projects are not necessarily commissioned from Welsh companies. They tend to be, you know, companies that are formed and headquartered and managed in London, who then deliver Welsh qualification. So it's the same issue across the board. And we do coordinate, we do work with Creative Wales, we do work closely with Northern Ireland Screen, and we do come together to try and drive change that will deliver better outcomes. But we're also all in competition, it's undeniable. And if Wales are doing really well in drama, returning drama, high-end drama, there's definitely something we need to compete there, and that's about our offer. What are the incentives that we offer? What are the relationships we have with the broadcasters, the platforms, and those
But how
production
do we
companies?
get to that? Because that's quite a big change, 60 to 80 hours to 180 to 220. That's quite a big difference in the drama side of things.
Yeah, I think it's driven by one or two productions, though. And if those productions go into abeyance, and Doctor Who's obviously not working currently, that will change.
Okay, with regards to the Doctor Who, brings me into the perfect scenario, because that's because of co-production with Disney that didn't quite work out in the end. But we had evidence last week that the way forward for drama in Scotland was co-production.
Yep.
You know, but we asked the question, why aren't we doing it? And the answer was, well, that's a question to ask people like yourself and the BBC themselves.
Yep.
Why aren't we doing so? Why aren't we doing more of that then?
I'm not sure that we're not doing that. I mean,
I'm not saying not. I'm
Yeah.
saying why aren't we doing more of it? They said that we should be doing a lot more of it.
the TV's going the way of film, so it's impossible to fund a film through one source these days. If you're making an independent production film, you have to finance out of lots of different territories and lots of different partners, and TV's going the same way. So the BBC once upon a time was the commissioner of a drama, and it would almost fully fund that drama. Just doesn't happen anymore. They don't have the funding to do it themselves, but the market's also moved on. So if you look at all of the productions that are currently underway in Scotland, with the exception of some of the bigger ones that are commissioned directly by somebody like Netflix or Sony, they will all be co-productions to some extent if they're targeting a public service broadcaster. So the BBC's replaced River City with Councils as the first drama out of the gates. There's also two other projects that are yet to start production. Councils, as far as I'm aware, is a co-production between multiple parties. You'll have had evidence from Scotland-based production companies. Synchronicity, I'm pretty sure, have been in recently. They made the Tattoos of Auschwitz. That was a co-production between different territories. So co-production is increasingly the norm when it comes to drama production. It's less prevalent in factual, but again, that's the way the world's going to go. You can't finance out of one territory anymore.
On the factual side, I just want to ask the question is, how do you compete with the YouTube and the kind of idea? Because A, it's not regulated, and B, the audiences that... I'll give you an example. I had, there was a fast food outlet and a social influencer in Scotland was invited to the first day in the one that was opened in Paisley, and he got figures on YouTube that would make the 7 at BBC Scotland blush. You know, so how do you compete with that? How do you get to a stage where you get the audience? I'll give the examples. Like one of the guys that works for me in my office, 30-something, 2 kids, family, doesn't watch STV News. I was talking about STV News the other day, doesn't watch it. But you can talk about something on YouTube or something like that, some documentary, I say, with it's not been really fact-checked or anything else, but it'll tell you the detail of that. How do we compete with that? How do we make the legacy TV and broadcasters relevant?
Make compelling content, deliver it where the audience is, and ensure that it's prominent. So the Media Act went through the UK Parliament last year. What it means in terms of prominence for the public service content is still unclear to me. But make good content that people want to watch, make it available to them where they want to watch it, and make it available in a way that they can see it. So that's about the algorithms that drive that content and the choices that viewers see.
And where do you think we are with our broadcasters in Scotland at this stage with doing that? I know BBC have dipped their toe, BBC Scotland, into trying to direct people from that content to the TV side of things. So other broadcasting, how do you think we're getting?
I think that they're on a journey, let's say, but I think they've obviously got a bind in that their numbers are measured across their broadcast platforms, not their YouTube platforms. Mm-hmm. So yeah, we as an agency, so I can't really speak for the BBC, but we as an agency recognise that we are focused on film production and television broadcast production, and the sector, the industry, the audience is migrating to online platforms. We don't have funding that's targeted towards those platforms at the moment, but I think we recognise that we have to develop interventions that will deliver better content. So there's one so far pilot project we've delivered with Cycling Scotland and Developing Mountain Biking in Scotland, which is called Fresh Cuts, where we looked at Scotland's rural economy, Scotland's kind of sports economy and visitor economy, and we thought, well, mountain biking's pretty big on YouTube. Can we work with those agencies to improve the quality of the outcomes, the quality of the programmes, the films that are made by Scotland-based outdoor sports content creators, and we've had 7 filmmakers go through the first iteration last year. It's a 2-part pilot. The second 6 start their course on Monday next week. I'm meeting them on Friday as an introduction session, and that's where we're dipping our toe into how do we upskill and improve the quality of the outputs in that online delivery space. But that's undeniably where the future lies.
Yep. And finally, just with regards to yourself with Screen Scotland, David, you've been very successful in getting productions here, major productions here in Scotland, and it's always nice to see filmed in Scotland or the Screen Scotland logo at the end of the credits. But how do we get to the stage where, you know, Canada is a major player in, when you look at movies at the end, it's obviously, like Hollywood effectively at one point in the 90s moved to Canada, and because there was incentive there for them to produce there. But the other one that always comes up on TV and film is Georgia, the state of Georgia for some reason. Can you explain to me why these are major players and how can we get ourselves to be in that position?
Because those governments, those regions, decided that this was an important area for them, and they invested in them, as the Scottish Government has through Screen Scotland over the last kind of 5 years. So we were formed in 2018, and we have seen consistent growth in both films made in Scotland and films and programmes from Scotland across that period as a direct consequence of that investment. On top of that, you've got to say the UK's tax regime for production is really attractive. It's uniform across the UK, and that's very valuable because it means there's no confusion for your average decision maker in Burbank for Warner Brothers who's thinking, well, is Scotland part of the UK or is it not part of the UK? How does that work? So the universality of that tax regime and its competitive ability in international markets is really important, but that's a constant competition. You know, Ireland's just improved its tax regime for production across both factual and scripted and unscripted. We don't really have incentives that target unscripted production, so that's a proper risk for us.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. I'm going to ask a very final quick question, hoping for a really short answer, and if it's not, I wonder if you'd consider writing back to the committee with a fuller answer. But it was in terms of, obviously, we're also the Constitution Committee, and you did mention the Westminster Committee and the fact that there wasn't any Scottish representation on that. And we've mentioned Wales and Northern Ireland as well. Is there a significant difference in the way Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland are treated as territories to how the regions are dealt with when it comes to the London governance of this whole area of the BBC?
I can't speak with any expertise about how the English regions are treated, but I know colleagues in Yorkshire and various other English regions would say that they are almost at a disadvantage in comparison to the nations of the UK on the basis that we have dedicated BBC channels, we have Channel 4 offices located here, we have in Scotland we have a dedicated Channel 3 licensee, and we have national screen agencies in each part of each of Wales, Northern Ireland and Scotland. That's probably the one area where I think the BBC is very focused at the moment, is how it does more outside of London but within England. We've seen MasterChef recently move to Birmingham. It's not an even picture across the UK, but it's also not an even picture between broadcasters.
Anyone else want a final thought?
I think in terms of the BBC, it is horses for courses in respect of how they treat people. I mean, Scotland has always had quite a strong presence within the BBC decision-making process. So, the English regions, again, as David said, there's different challenges for them, there's different support for them. I think one of the key things going forward, though, is that in terms of commissioning, the BBC's head of commissioning for the nations are now working with each of the genre commissioners, which they never did before, so that across the UK there should be a much more even spread of, better support for unscripted work, and a much more even spread of where that work goes. And is it being commissioned by BBC Scotland and a Scottish-based production, or is it a network production that is not being sold as a Scottish-based production, even although we would want it to be made in Scotland, because at the end of the day, our members don't care who gets the profits from the production, they want to know the jobs are in Scotland. and a lot of the profits just end up going back to, you know, multinational companies at the end of the day, regardless of who's employing them.
Okay. Do you have anything to add, Emily?
I agree with David, I think, in terms of sort of a lack of representation perhaps within the English regions, and I think they look at INVI towards some of the advocacy that Screen Scotland sort of represents.
Okay, that's great. I'm going to very quickly say thank you, and we're going for your attendance this morning. We're going to suspend for 5 minutes and then come back. Thank you. Sorry, can we start? Thank you. A warm welcome back to committee. We are joined in the room for a second panel with representatives of Ofcom. We have Christina Nicolotti-Squires, Group Director of Broadcasting Media Group, Glenn Preston, Director of Scotland, and Stephen Webster, Regulatory Affairs Manager. And a warm welcome to you all. And I would like to invite Christina to make a short opening statement. Thank you.
Thank you very much, and thank you for inviting me back again. I was here, I think it was May last year. We're of course very happy to answer questions on anything that's taking part in your inquiry, but I thought I wanted to acknowledge our open consultation on the proposed changes to STV's news output, which I know is of great interest to the committee and indeed to people across Scotland. I am perhaps a bit biased, as after 35 years in broadcast and digital journalism, but I believe that the provision of duly impartial, accurate news, which reflects the worlds of everybody, is probably the most important part of public service media. And as we said in our recent PSM review, the public service broadcasters remain the most trusted source of news amongst audiences. And regional news plays a particularly important part in keeping audiences informed about life in their areas. As you'll be aware, in December of last year, we consulted on some proposed changes to STV's regional news production. We believe it will see audiences in Scotland to continue to receive high-quality regional news with a distinct regional character and allow STV to move towards what we call a content-led newsroom rather than one built around the supremacy of the 6 o'clock news. And that's really similar to what all newsrooms are undergoing. They're becoming digital first, or they're becoming platform neutral, not making the needs around one particular piece of output. STV came to us in the autumn of this year with a set of proposals we didn't really feel went far enough to preserve the distinctiveness of regional news for audiences in the north of Scotland. We had a pretty robust back and forth with them, which resulted in the revised proposal that we think puts STV's news on a sustainable footing, whilst also making sure audience have access to trusted regional news on TV as well as online, which increasingly is where they're getting it. This is a compromise, but reached because we have to be realistic about the pressures that STV is under at the moment. We also need to be realistic in recognising STV is not alone in having to make difficult decisions about how to keep its sustainability, how to thrive rather than just survive. ITV, as you know, is in talks with Sky over a potential sale, and we're likely to see more of this kind of consolidation in the future. And we've seen even the biggest global players are having to adapt. Just last week, I had the General Counsel of Skydance Paramount explaining to me why they thought they ought to buy Warner Brothers. But coming back to our role here, our job is to deliver on the objective of public service broadcasting so that people can continue to enjoy high-quality programmes that are of interest right across the UK. We strongly believe, as we set out in that report, Transmission Critical, that our regulation shouldn't stifle innovation or prevent broadcasters from adapting. Rather, it should support them so they can continue to serve audiences in this increasingly challenging and constantly changing and evolving environment. I was very taken, Mr. Kerr, by your talk about somebody in your office, or might have been Mr. Adam, apologies, who doesn't watch STV News. He gets everything off YouTube, and that's a real example of how audiences' behaviour is changing. So our consultation is open until the 9th of February. Once we've examined the range of views, and there have been a range of views that have come in, we're hoping to publish a statement this side of Easter. We want to make it timely. We'll do that based on evidence. And I think it's really important to look at how audiences are behaving. 88% of Scottish people tell us they prefer online services such as websites and apps to get their local news and information. The average weekly reach of STV News at 6 fell to 18% in 2022 and was just 14% across the year last year. STV, like ITV, faces real challenges to its financial sustainability. Our regulation needs to enable them to adapt to the modern model of consumption and provide flexibility to all PSB broadcasters in Scotland to meet these challenges, while supporting the provision of trusted news content to audiences where they want to receive it. And that's really crucial. Audiences are migrating, their behaviour is changing. I'm, of course, happy, along with my colleagues, to answer questions on this and any of Ofcom's wider work. Thank you very much.
Thank you for that introduction. In your letter to us on the 16th of December, you were you stated that you were proposing to approve STV's request. Does this mean the decision has already been made and the consultation is no longer?
Consultation is open to the 9th of February. We haven't alighted on a firm decision. We will, as I said, we'll take all the range of views that are put across in that consultation and we will examine them and we will put out a statement in due course. As I said, we're aiming to do it before Easter.
Okay. And in terms
our
of...
minds are not made up.
Okay. In terms of our broadcasting inquiry, what do you see as the main challenges facing the broadcasting sector in Scotland, and what aspects of its work could the BBC improve on in Scotland with the Charter and renewal of progress at the moment?
I'll do a little bit on that, and then obviously I'll hand over to my colleagues. I think what you've heard earlier from the other people who've been sitting here, we would probably agree with. But I think the most important thing is, and I haven't heard it said an awful lot, is the changing audience behaviour. And we can't regulate to a world where and pretending that audiences are still consuming content in the same way they were 20 years ago. And I think that is the biggest challenge. Audiences have actually had it never so good as far as I can tell. There's such a huge range of content you can watch on all sorts of different platforms at the time you want, in the manner you want, whether it's on your iPad in a hotel room or whether it's on a TV in your sitting room. But that does provide real challenges to a broadcasting industry, particularly the PSB sector and the commercial PSB sector, that has a financial model based on advertising. And as the audience fragments, that has been a real challenge. So I think the biggest challenge to the broadcasting industry in Scotland is to make sure that you're still getting the representation of people, that great content is still being made that represents people right across this nation, and it's being made on a place that they are accessing and using.
If I may, convener, maybe just adding a few additional thoughts to Christina's. So if we think about the kind of sector in Scotland specifically, there are really positive elements to it. So we've seen growth in successive years, dating right back to 2010. So the numbers then were about £119 million in terms of spend on external productions. In 2022, which is the last figures we have, they're up to £225 million. So it's a substantial change in that 15-year period. And we've got companies that are both local and global, seeing Scotland as a place where they can make high-quality programmes across the range of genres that you were discussing in your first kind of evidence session here. And I think David Smith from Screen Scotland made a very good point about the well-developed infrastructure that's in place now. So we've seen actually both governments, both Scottish and UK governments, committing spend on the development of studio spaces. And obviously we have a skilled workforce, so that may be something that you want to return to. But we also know that it's been quite a challenging, certainly last 3 or 4 years for a range of reasons. So there are inflationary pressures, and there's been a significant slowdown in production, not just in Scotland or the UK, but globally. But we do think there are still wins to celebrate in that kind of context. So that mixed production ecology that I mentioned, excuse me, sees drama being made here, sees daytime being made here, returning series, other popular formats from our public service broadcasters and from the major streamers too. We've heard from stakeholders over the last couple of years that there hadn't been enough original drama made in Scotland. That's something you talked about, I think, in the first session this morning as well. But we do think that's now changing. So in the last year or so, we've seen a number of limited-run series commissioned and broadcast, such as Cold Water, Summer Water, Half Man. I think there was reference to Councils, which is the Hope for a Returning series that's been filmed on the shore of Loch Lomond at the moment, which some of our colleagues have been visiting over the last few weeks. And of course, there's hugely popular returning series such as Shetland, which I think is on series 10 now as well. And we're particularly pleased to hear that Netflix Department Q, which had just launched, I think, the last time we were in front of you in May last year, is renewed. And we can expect a season 2 within the next 12 months or so. The other thing to say is that news plurality remains quite strong, with audiences well served with content at a network level from the public service broadcasters and the likes of Sky News, alongside that regional news provision from BBC Scotland. Christina touched on STV, and we should also reference ITV Border, who are very active in that space too. But we do recognise the need for this to change as audience habits for news evolve, and the importance of having that trusted and accurate news content in digital spaces become greater. And I'll end, if I may, just on radio, because I don't think that was touched on this morning. It does remain really popular in Scotland, so we've got 87% of adults tuning into live radio each week. Commercial radio is doing particularly well, reaching over half of people in any given week. You may want to ask us or refer to the launch of STV Radio, which is a nationwide kind of digital offering that's part of this transformation that they're committed to. And we've seen plans from Bauer, for example, to move and invest in a new studio in Glasgow city centre for Clyde One. So that's a really positive picture. But I'll stop there, Convener.
Okay, thank you. Going to move to questions from the committee, if that's okay, by bringing Mr Adam first.
Thank you, Convener. Good morning, everyone. I was going to continue on the changing audiences, because although there are changing audiences and they're accessing news, like STV being a classic example, the STV journalists in here will actually talk about how they do something for STV News, but they'll try and direct people in the way of STV News by using the short form, by using something for kind of TikTok in order to try and do it that way. And I see that we heard earlier today that they're trying to, the legacy kind of broadcasters are trying to use that as a way to get people to look at that. So I'm quite kind of interested in that. But I do have a concern, because there has been a long-term reduction in locally produced hours in commercial radio in Scotland. And now we've got the potential approval of STV North's 6 PM news. I'm really looking for assurances from Ofcom to give the committee. How are you acting effectively as a regulator in Scotland, rather than simply ratifying the decisions of broadcasters?
Well, we're not ratifying decisions of broadcasters. As I said, we didn't accept STV's original proposal, and we had quite robust conversations with them.
The next you've got could be taken up by weather and a bit of sport from Aberdeen.
As I said, that's still open to consultation, and we will hold them to account on whatever we end up approving. We'll hold them to account on. I went to Aberdeen just before Christmas, wasn't it? And met with all the people in the newsroom there, and you know, I've worked in the same situation that they have. I know how much local and regional news is really loved by communities and by the people who make it. What was really interesting to me was that the people in that room, must be about 30 staff, I think, were very keen to ensure that they weren't just delivering for a decreasing linear audience, that they all wanted to make sure that their stories from their area were given more more prominence in sort of STV's overall news output in terms of digital. And at the moment, what they have is the delivery of every story, whether it's on TikTok or Instagram, has to go through a sort of a bottleneck in Glasgow. And so one of the proposals that one of the things that STV is committed to is to making sure that is removed, and so that the journalists, which are, you know, they are keeping their news gathering right across the northern belt, is to make sure that as well as doing a story, rather than spending their whole day thinking about the story they're doing for the 6 o'clock, they're actually doing a story that may well appear on the 6th, but will also appear in places with much higher audiences on TikTok, on Instagram, on Facebook, whichever it is. So I think that it is making sure that those broadcasters, and we've done it quite effectively with the BBC in our we do an annual report every year on the BBC's performance, and you know we've made it very clear they need to be making news where people are watching it, and I think that, you know, so I joined Ofcom 2 years ago. I'd been at Sky for 5 or 6 years, and that's exactly a pivot we did. We started. There were concerns about it. The old idea that you could get people to only come to your platform to consume your news, that just doesn't work. And so getting organisations to put their product on TikTok, on Facebook or Instagram, as I said, wherever it is, with attribution to their brand, because that's really important. The legacy of those brands are really important.
Can I just bring you back to what we're talking about here today? The deliver on, you said in your opening statement, you deliver on the subject of public sector broadcasting is really important to you, but you shouldn't stop broadcasters adapting. Now, I'm getting to the stage now where I don't blame broadcasters at this stage, because they seem to get everything they ask for from Ofcom. So what practical purpose does Ofcom, as a regulator presence in Scotland, actually serve the audience? Because the audience is the most important thing here.
Absolutely.
And there's a whole part of the north east of Scotland that literally won't be getting a news from STV that's tailored to them.
It won't be getting as many minutes on a linear programme at 6 o'clock that was tailored to them.
But it's
which
the key
is going
show.
in it, which is in it, the numbers of people consuming that are going
It's
down
the key
and down
show.
and down.
It's the key show in STV's kind of lineup.
In its linear lineup, it is, but they will be getting more news on the places where they are consuming news, and that's the difference.
So how? But I'm getting to the stage that any time broadcasters, whether it be local broadcasters or anyone else, Ofcom tend to allow them to do it. You know, we have seen radio actually go from Clyde 1 as a screaming success. We know that. But there was a Clyde 2 at one point and a Forth 2. There no longer is that. There was the case of Capital Radio Scotland going down and networking from down south. And it was actually the radio station that said they'd lost their audience and they brought everybody back up, and they've got Heart and Capital up here in Scotland now as well. But that's one of the few times where it's gone the other way. Most times it goes the network.
I will let my colleague
south.
Stefan answer specifically on those radio things, but I just want to be very clear. The idea that you have that Ofcom just waves everything through, simply is not really fact. For example, the BBC recently asked for 5 variations of their licence, and we said no to 2 of them. We don't always just wave things through, we do push back. And particularly in the case of STV's thing, we said to them, we are not going to approve this unless you adapt it. And their original proposal was far from what's being proposed now. Do you want to pick up on the radio things?
Yeah, I think so. Radio is a slightly different matter. I think we've been in front of this committee before, where we've explained that deregulation was a legislative intervention from the UK Parliament that allowed things like formats, things like hours of being made in particular parts of local areas to fall away. And that was a decision by the UK Parliament that we then needed to follow through. I think the Capital example is a really good one, though, because the way things are going is these decisions by broadcasters, whether you're on TV or you're on radio, must be audience-led. And Global, when it came to Capital, when it came to Heart, realised they'd made a wrong decision in vacating the space in Scotland and putting network content out there because it didn't work with their audience. So they brought it back. That's how it should work. And STV have seen an opportunity to do something similar and do a radio station for Scotland that's broadcasting across the nation. It launched last week. We wish that well. But again, that has to be audience-led. And if there's a market for these programmes that are locally based here in Scotland, that's great, and we support that. And regulation has to allow that to be the lead of where services are coming from now.
Well, that's part of the problem with this situation we're in at the moment, because the timing is absolutely lousy, where you've got a situation where the regulated hours that they've got to give in part of their licence in STV North, previously Grand Prix TV, is effectively being cut when news in the area, and they're launching STV Radio. It almost looks like an argument has been made by unions and others that you're taking journalist jobs away to pay for an STV radio station.
There's a couple of things on that. I mean, it's not for the regulator to be telling any public service broadcaster how it spends its money. That's rightly for STV's board and leadership to decide.
But the STV North kind of licence is your part.
Of course, and that's why we're consulting on changes that we think are right for audiences going forward. I would say there is a narrative that I think has come out that this is journalist jobs being lost at the expense of a radio station. I don't think that's quite true. If you look at what we published in our consultation, STV have set out quite difficult efficiencies across their organisation that they're trying to meet. I think it's around £8 million over the next few years. News is a small part of that, but they're making savings across studios, across central functions, across other parts of audiences as well. So I think it just sets out that more bigger challenge that all media companies are facing now as they have to adapt and find audiences. And particularly for commercial public service broadcasters, they have to try and find business opportunities that they can generate revenue from, that they can grow from, that will help them as a business first and foremost, but will help cross-subsidise some of the more expensive obligations that are really, really important, like trusted and accurate local news. And we think STV is getting there with the proposals that we're consulting on at the moment.
Just finally, I just want to ask us, do you believe that we are losing news, local news, to STV North, even with your revised situation? Because I can see, as I've already said, the few extra minutes you've got can be taken up with the weather in Aberdeen and who Aberdeen Football Club have signed that day. So effectively, you know, there is a loss of news. There has to be admit there is a loss of local news if this new proposal goes through.
There's a loss of local news, perhaps on a linear television programme which fewer and fewer people watching. There will be more news on the platforms that people are using to consume news. That is what the outcome should be. We will be monitoring, if the proposal goes ahead, we will be monitoring STV to make sure that the programme that comes out of Glasgow has got a good range of material that's of interest to people right across Scotland, and we'll be holding them to account on that. Yes, there may be less specific news for people on STV North on a programme that fewer and fewer people watching from every year, but there'll be more news on the platforms that people are increasingly turning to.
Finally, convener, is the fact that basically, you know, is it not a concern that it was only about a year ago that STV applied for the licence again, and now we're in a situation where it's all changed. It's all changed a year later, and you, just to get some round it, your role in this is for the audiences, and at the same time also to ensure that you don't put companies into a position as a regulator where they're unprofitable or they could go under. But STV is nowhere near that at this stage. Yes, there has been issues, but they're nowhere near that position at this point.
No, I really hope they're not, and they don't seem to be in that position at the moment. But sustainability and their ability to be able to continue to broadcast news and to make it is really, really important. And so our decision making has to be based on the needs of the audience, which I've already demonstrated. They're not watching it on linear, they're consuming it on digital, so that's a really key thing. But also the sustainability. ITV, which is a much bigger organisation, feels it can't carry on making its news without the help of Sky. Now, that deal hasn't gone through yet, and let's see where it does. STV is facing really big challenges, like all broadcasters, and so our regulation needs to enable them to be able to flex themselves to do if they think that a radio station is a good idea and it gives them more financial opportunities and it does carry news and the radio sector is doing better than the linear sector has, then we have to be able to do that. It's a balancing point. I'd love us to be able to say you can do everything and say to them, you know, you've got the money, you've got to do all these different things. But we're in the UK and across the world, public service broadcasting is really under threat.
Just for the record, convener, I'm a big fan of STV Radio because I seem to be the key demographic they're looking for. So, just for the record.
One kind of supplementary point, and I'm also a fan of STV Radio and also the demographic that they're aiming for as well. There is a kind of, it's worth saying, because I think it's an understandable question, one about licence renewal, and then, you know, so quickly thereafter you feel like that, you know, that there's changes. There's a kind of quirk to the process for that. So quite a lot of the negotiations on the relicensing positions started back in kind of 2021, and they were largely concluded in 2023, so 2 to 3 years ago already. And the way in which the statute set out actually doesn't allow us to revisit the terms of the licence at the time. So it can only be renewed on the basis as it was previously, once we've done what's called the kind of sustainability test. But that's already a number of years old. So that's the reason that we're now in this position, that when we renewed the licence, it was on the same terms as it was previously. But over the last 2 or 3 years, as the circumstances have changed for STV, that they've come to us to request the revision.
And a big fall in audience, actually, over that 2-year period.
Just a quick question on the demographic issue is that, yes, audiences are changing, and yes, there's a different view of licence fee for the BBC, etc., etc., etc. But for BBC, STV, Channel 4, is it is there not a responsibility that Ofcom ensures that everyone has access, so that the demographic that is probably a bit older, people who are digitally excluded, should still have an opportunity to access these news programmes? And if we see what happened in the North East just in the last week, where above Aberdeen, the situation for the country was completely different from the rest of the country, is that not that localised news broadcasting from Aberdeen not absolutely vital?
I would expect that in the circumstances that they had a couple of weeks ago with the weather, that the majority of that programme, or a lot of that programme out of Glasgow, would be focusing on the situation in the North East, because it's a big story. It's a big national story rather than a specific one to the North East. Digital exclusion is a really important thing. But it's not just in television. It's in you can't make a doctor's appointment without you having to use an app these days. So I'm very mindful that older audiences do want to watch. They are the audience for those linear things. But they also, I think we mustn't stereotype people above a certain age. And look, I'm 60, so I'm hardly a spring chicken. But our own research shows that actually the biggest growing number of people who were turning to YouTube on the TV set in the living rooms was actually people older than 50. So it's not just I think it's important to make sure that older people are getting the news where they get it. But increasingly, and as I said, the proposal that we've had so far, we are minded, subject to what other people put in the consultation, we are minded does achieve that balance.
Okay. I think the North East members that have given evidence to this committee might have a different view from the correspondence I've had from the constituencies, but that's already on the record. So I'm going to move on. Mr Bibby.
Thanks, Convener. Good morning to the panel. I agree with what you said earlier about local news being the most trusted news, and it's never been more important, particularly in a time of misinformation online. Also, it's important to our democracy. We've got a Scottish Parliament election coming up shortly, and the importance of local news is really, really important. In terms of, you mentioned earlier an example where you anticipated that stories affecting the North East would still be on the national news programme. One of the issues that's been raised, clearly there are major concerns about the impact that any proposals to access TV North would have on the north of Scotland. But if you move to a national programme, out of Glasgow, there would be a dilution of news for other areas of Scotland if you were moving to a national programme as well. So there would be an impact on Glasgow in the west, Edinburgh in the east. To what extent have you considered those issues alongside the action of STV North?
Yeah, Stefan might want to come in with some of the kind of detail on this as well. So I think that the short answer to the question is that we have considered this. So what you have to bear in mind is that these are a series of requests from STV that relate actually to both licences, because there are provisions for opts, for example, for the central licence, which, as you rightly point out, Mr Bibby, required previously them to do kind of stuff for Glasgow in the west and Edinburgh the east, that they've also asked to remove from their licence obligations as well. So there's 2 or 3 elements to this proposal. They're not just about the kind of minutage that relates to the STV North licence element, but also to how the licence functions in the central belt as well. Stephen?
Yeah, I think the crucial part of this that's really, really important, more so than where the programme comes from, is where's the news gathering resource. And STV have been quite clear, and actually it ties into what will be a licence condition going forward for them in terms of how can they demonstrate that those programmes are made in both areas, is that they have significant news gathering resource across both central and north Scotland. News can work from a studio pre-recorded, as long as the stories are being gathered in the areas where they're serving, and that's the important part here. And that is true. This has maybe been a bit lost in the discussion. It's as true in central Scotland as it is for the north of Scotland as well, because there's undoubtedly going to be a change in how that news programme looks and feels to audiences. But our view is that is necessary for STV to modernise its news gathering approach and continue to move to serving audiences increasingly where they're getting their news from.
In terms of the process, you said earlier it's not Ofcom's job. We're not waving things through, but you've talked about the need to compromise. Why compromise when STV is a profitable business? They're investing in entertainment and drama. They're investing, as we've just heard, in a new radio station. Why is there a need to compromise in relation to this issue?
I think the cuts that they're proposing in news are not confined to news at all. And you probably know better on the figures than me, but they are, they've been making significant cuts right across all their different genres and different outputs.
Yeah, that's right. I mentioned earlier, I think they've said themselves, since in our consultation, there's £8 million of savings STV is looking to make in the next couple of years, and a proportion of that, but certainly a minority of the proportion of that is in news. So this is, we're not in a position to second guess STV's leadership in telling us, what their financial position is. We've obviously looked at the numbers, and I think we recognise the challenges they're facing.
It's not your job to second guess.
Yeah.
They're a profitable organisation that makes a profit. So it's not second guessing, that's...
Yeah, no,
that's
that's right.
Fact.
Currently, yeah.
Yeah, and I think the level of profit went down quite significantly in the last reporting year. So this is a reaction to that. I think it did. I think it was in our consultation, the operating profit level. And I think the point there is, we recognise the reasoning that STV has come to us with this on, that news needs support from other profitable parts of the organisation, and that's all laid out in the consultation. But these are actually the areas that we're really interested in and keen to hear from people as part of the consultation on where people might think we might have erred on.
Some figures I've got some I think was in our submission, but STV's linear revenue was 99 million in 2021, dropping 15% to 84 million in 2024. Their digital revenues were largely unchanged at around 20 million. Their regional news costs have increased by 7% between 21 and 24, and are forecasted to increase by another 7% between 24 and 27.
I'll come to you next, Miss.
I'm happy.
I suspect there will be, yeah.
Okay.
Mr. Bibby, do you want to go back in?
Well, the facts are that STV still is profitable and a profitable organisation, and we have an Ofcom regime and regulation and potential amendments to the licence that's been granted to prevent any sort of significant failure in terms of public service broadcasting, not to allow profitable organisations to make cuts to potentially boost their share price. I mean, in terms of those savings, and they're making savings, and they need to compromise, will Ofcom require STV to ring-fence those savings to reinvest in Scottish journalism? Or is the risk that these savings could be used to bolster shareholder dividends or executive bonuses?
A financially sustainable STV is good for Scotland more widely. That's not the model of regulation that we have, and I don't think there's a model where we'd be able to allow them to do that. I think that the significant point that we can do is ensure that they are maintaining significant news gathering resources across both of their licensed areas. That is part of their licence, and that is something we'll be continuing to look at.
When we had STV News here before, I found it hard to understand the claim that a significant reduction in the number of journalists working in the organisation and a dilution of regional news was going to result in more content. Now, that was repeated there. Ofcom believe that there's going to be less journalists but more content. I couldn't understand that when STV News said that before, and given that Ofcom appear to be agreeing with that statement, I'd be interested to know how less journalists results in more content.
From a production point of view, if you're making a television package to go out onto a linear programme, you've got to involve a reporter, usually a camera person, although they can often be doing the same thing. And then you've got to have somebody editing it, although again the same person can do that and generally quite often does. You then have to have the technical infrastructure for the linear feed. Somebody uploading a story on TikTok can do all of that themselves. They can do all of it in a more efficient way. So delivery of digital news requires less people. So I think that probably does stand. How many journalists is it now that they're actually, remind me that the figure, it's 6, isn't it, from the North East? Journalists, I think.
Journalists 3, maybe 6 staff.
Yeah, 6 staff in total and 3 journalists from the North East. So we are, and any journalist's job, of course, is an important one, but it's sort of a huge number. And actually delivering, you can deliver more content with fewer people if you're putting more of it on digital.
Well, I'd be interested to know what your analysis is of how many, if they cut any more journalists, at what point does they produce less news? I don't know. Does there been any investigation into that or not?
I think the important point there is that they will still have licence obligations being placed on them for delivery, and they'll have to report against those licence obligations, and we'll have to make an assessment of those things and publicly hold them to account for whether we see those types of changes. So there are obligations, for example, for them to produce something called a kind of statement of programme policy, which may include that type of information that will allow us to interrogate it or to use our information gathering powers to ask for it in future, once we make a decision about what the licence should actually say and look like.
Thanks, Kevin.
Thank you, Mr. Kerr.
Just going back to the results. I mean, the results that are published are the STV, the listed company I'm talking about, had revenues of 188 million for the year 2024, which was reported early 25. Profits were, after tax, were 13.1 million, up from 5.3 million the year before. So I don't know what, I mean, these are the published numbers. I don't know where these other numbers have come from, or what part of STV they've chosen to separate out and report separately. But I would have thought that STV, the listed company, owned these 2 licences, no? Yes. So I don't understand why we've got 2 sets of numbers.
I think it's a question about the margin there, I think, and I'm sorry, I don't have the details in front of me, but I can come back on that.
It's just that when Christina says STV are under all kinds of pressure at the minute, I'm kind of forced to conclude that if the profitability went up for that last year, and they've got, I don't know what the 2025 numbers are going to look like. They may have given you some advanced sight of provisional numbers, I don't know. But they've also got 2026 ahead of them, which should be a good year for commercial broadcasters in this country because of the World Cup, because people enjoy live TV for sport above everything else. So, you know, I'm forced to conclude that, and it's on the back of your comments, Christina, about ITV can't do the news now without Sky. Are we just saying that STV is too small to survive?
No, that's not the conclusion I was trying to make. I was just saying that public service broadcasting across the piece is really struggling in terms of financial sustainability. And that is right across the board, from the BBC to Channel 4 to ITV and to STV. What I want to make sure is that STV not only survives, but actually also it thrives and it continues to deliver news, but delivers news in a way to the places where audiences are consuming it and not tied to a legacy model of doing everything for a programme that people are watching in fewer numbers. But has the ability to take its production and its strategy to a more digital world.
But because of the changes of executive leadership at STV over the last months, it does, and the fact that we know there are talks going on between STV and ITV. At least that's what we were told last week, if I remember correctly. ITV and Sky. ITV and Sky, I beg your pardon. I mean, there is a concern in Scotland that you'll understand that STV will be absorbed into ITV and then into the bigger global corporation that is known in this country as Sky. But am I understanding correctly that Ofcom wouldn't take a view on that either? Who owns the licences in terms of the parent companies?
The ownership of the licences is something that we take a view on, very much so. There is, at the moment, there is nothing on the table by anybody to suggest that a licence should be changed. The ownership of a licence should be changing. ITV and Sky have confirmed they're in talks. No proposal has been brought forward. If that proposal is put forward, Ofcom will play a role if the Secretary of State decides there should be a public interest test, and there are various procedures. the people who own the licences is very important to us, and if that is proposed to be changed, if someone comes along and says STV wants to sell to whoever, then of course we'll take a view on it. I'm not going to speculate on something that hasn't actually happened.
But you can understand our concerns.
I'll totally understand your concerns, yes.
And there are two licences we're talking about here.
Yep.
And effectively, you've changed the conditions for both of the licences, but particularly for STV North. Have you ever actually done that before, just to give us some idea of precedent? Have you ever actually said to a licence holder, you can stop broadcasting local news, and it's going to be absorbed into a neighbouring licence's news programme, and their news programme is also going to be diluted? I mean, have you ever done that before?
Not at the time that I've been here, but I'm trying to remember when I was in ITV, and the situation on ITV is that there were many more regional hubs for production of news then. When I started at ITV, which is a very long time ago, the Central had Nottingham, it had Birmingham, and had one other, I think.
But within licence areas?
No, but I think this is probably the first licence version in this instance. Am I correct?
Well, I think
I'm also mindful that others might want to do something down the line. I don't know.
Yeah, I think there's a couple of points here. One is that we get requests from licence holders for variation all the time, right across the licensing regime, across broadcasting, like television broadcasting and on radio as well. So they come to us all the time for all sorts of different reasons. They might change a format request for the type of music they have on a radio station, for example. Or
slightly different.
No, I understand, but I'm saying that it's not uncommon for somebody that owns a licence to come to us and think about variation. I understand this is more fundamental than that, but just that type of thing does happen regularly.
Yeah, that's...
It's worth. Sorry, there's another point that's worth making here as well. It's specifically in relation to the two STV-owned licences at the moment, so the Central licence and the North licence. There's nothing that stops any licence holder, whether it's STV, or anybody else that would happen to own the Central and North licences, from coming to us and saying, we don't think these are sustainable licences anymore, and to hand it back to us. And that's one of the factors that we would have to weigh up in thinking about the future sustainability questions that we've been talking about to you as well. So it's feasible, whether it was STV or another commercial company could say to us, we don't think that this licence is a sustainable thing anymore.
So did STV say that?
No, they haven't said that at all, but these are elements that are in our mind when we're having to make
there's no precedent.
There's
no precedent I'm hearing, at least in your knowledge, for what you've done with STV North.
There's a couple of aspects to that as well. So there is no licence requirement for where the studio and presentation comes from. I think you heard that from STV as well. So there are examples in elsewhere in the UK where the studio presentation for one licence is done in another licensed area.
But not diluted?
No, perhaps not. So
the dilution of the local news content. I understand the point you're making about broadcast.
So I'm sorry to pick you up on that, but the dilution of specific content from the Northern Belt on one programme is being diluted.
It's a very important one programme, though.
It's a programme
in Scotland.
It is a very important programme which decreasing numbers of people are watching, and people are telling us they want to get their local news from digital sources, and so I wouldn't characterise it as a dilution in the whole. It's a dilution on a specific programme.
I understand the point you're making, but I'm trying to make the point to you that you've effectively merged these two licences. There are not two licences now. You've effectively, de facto, decided that STV North and...
Well, we haven't made a decision yet.
But I think you have. I think you have, because you've signalled that you are favourably disposed.
I'm very happy to say that I haven't made a decision.
No, but you're favourably disposed to the proposition.
Subject to what people say in the consultation.
I think that was the one area where we pushed back on with STV. The need for some level, a balanced level of distinct regional distinction between the two licensed areas wasn't there in the original proposal. It came back in the second proposal, so that was important to us.
But you understand why I might conclude that you effectively merged these two licensed areas when it comes to local news content. You've basically said you don't have to have local news content in STV North, it's all going to be done out of Glasgow.
That isn't what we've said. And I think at the end of this process, which we've still got to get consultation responses in for, and we'll have to make a decision about all of this based on the evidence that's been put out in our consultation and is presented to us. But if we were to go with the proposal that's up for consultation at the moment, there will still be 2 licences and there will still be distinct content prepared. I understand the point you're making that with less minutage,
it's not the same though, is it?
No, I understand that.
It's not the same though, is it?
No, but
No,
as we've said,
So-
that our expectation of this is, one, that there's still that news gathering resource in each of the licence areas. So STV have already committed to still having journalists on the ground in Inverness, Aberdeen,
You are in
Dundee, for
Aberdeen.
example. Yeah, I absolutely, and that's their choice. But there will be 2 licences with distinction in them. And what we would expect to see, and we will hold them to account for this, is also that regional content available on those other platforms. That's what they've committed to doing.
You'll forgive me if I say I think you're struggling to justify what you've effectively done, which is to bring together the 2 licences. I mean, I think you look at it in any other business context, what you've done is you've merged something together.
Well, we haven't actually, because it's not a merge. It's not a merge. There will still be 2 separate licences. There will still be 2 separate licences.
I'm only giving you my view,
You're right, of course.
which is based on your answers.
Thank you, Stephen. Can I bring in Mr Harvey? Thanks.
Convener, I wanted to come on to some of the wider issues in the broadcasting inquiry. I don't know if you want to allow anyone else who wants to ask about STV to come in first.
Oh no, Mr Brown wants to come in, and Mr Halker-Johnson there. Everyone wants to come in basically, but we'll come to you last if that's okay. If you could be succinct, I know it's difficult, but I'm sorry about the timings today.
Just 2 questions, and one is on the STV thing. But the first one really is just the discussion has been about whether or not Sky might be taking over ITV. And I know it might not be central to the questioning so far, but I'm just interested in what Ofcom's view is on the absolutely atrocious Sky press review that they hold every night, where you get a vaguely leftist or Labour-supporting journalist and an avowedly right-wing journalist to give their unbiased views on the unbiased print media to an unbiased interviewer. It's just, how that serves Scotland or anywhere else. I don't know whether Ofcom have ever looked at that or taken a view, and I'd just be interested, especially with Christina's previous experience of Sky. I'm not sure how long that was, but just be interested to hear your view.
It came under my remit, yes. Look, that programme, or that bit of programming is, like all other programming that we licence, is subject to due impartiality rules, which we enforce. If we get major complaints about a particular item, then we will investigate that. From my own experience, I mean, I haven't watched it for a while, so it's been a couple of years since I left, but from my own experience, I think that generally speaking, there's a pretty decent balance and range of views on that. In terms of a format of a programme, that's not the broadcasters themselves have the freedom to come up with formats of programmes and as they see fit. As long as they're duly impartial and duly accurate, then that's as far as our views go.
I just cannot see how anybody could say that was impartial, but leave that aside. On the substantive question about the STV licence, you said when you first spoke, Christina, quite rightly, about the various pressures in terms of how audiences are moving, and I understand that point and don't disagree with that. However, the point is, of course, the licence was agreed months before STV sought to completely change it, in my view. And Glenn provided a bit of an explanation for saying, well, that might have happened 2 years ago, and I don't know exactly how the phrase was, but you can't really, it doesn't matter what the licence renewal is, you're obliged to agree what was previously agreed, or words to that effect. I don't know whether you can see in that process why the public has absolutely no trust. And I'm not saying it's necessarily Ofcom's fault. If that's the way the government has set it up, if you can only agree what was previously the licence, and also to say that the points that you made about the way the audience is changing and trying to make sure STV is sustainable, that's not happened in the last few months. That's been going on for years. Everyone could see that for years. So do you understand why there's a complete lack of trust in the process from the public, who will see and expect when a licence is agreed that will be for the 10-year period, or at least a substantial part of it, rather than a few months before it's completely changed?
I understand the point you're making. I think that and I can do the kind of chapter and verse bit either now or in writing to the committee if it's easier, just to explain the process that was behind renewal and why we are only allowed to renew on the basis of the kind of provisions that were in the previous licence. I'm happy to explain to the committee in writing why that's the case. I think the other point to make is a licence holder can come to us as the regulator at any point in the process. So I hear what you're saying about this. There may be a public expectation that when you renew a licence, it's, you know, you're not going to see substantive change within the first handful of years, for example, for a 10-year duration licence. But that isn't the way that the legislative framework is structured or our regulatory duties are structured. So any organisation, whether it's STV or someone else who owns a licence, can come to us at any point in the licence process or for the duration of the licence and ask for changes. And that's essentially what's happened in this circumstance.
Yeah, I'll just conclude by saying, looking at how fundamentally STV has changed, or seeking to change, and what the public has a right to expect, I cannot see how you can do anything other than reject, at least substantially, what they intend to do. I mean, otherwise, you're just losing public trust. Anyway, I know we're short for time. Convener, I'll leave it at that.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Brown. Can I bring in Mr. Halker-Johnson?
Thank you very much. Good morning. A lot of the issues have been covered, and I don't want to kind of repeat them. Just to kind of go back to this, you said our minds are not made up. I mean, the letter that we've received from you says we're proposing to approve STV's request. In our view, STV's proposal will ensure that audiences continue to be served with high-quality regional news provision on a sustainable basis for STV. That sounds pretty made up. But if you're
consultation, perhaps those words have been put in that letter.
Well, possibly so. What could make you change your mind?
Well, with all consultation processes, we take into account the range of views, the volume of views that have been provided, and we will perhaps go back to the licence holder on this occasion and say, you know, might have further discussions with them. But we think that the proposal they're putting forward is the best thing for audiences across Scotland and for the sustainability of the STV licence.
I mean, it doesn't sound like there's much that. I mean, you're not telling me anything that would really change.
I personally haven't seen any of the consultation responses.
I mean, if I were thinking of replying to the consultation, I'd probably think, well, they've made their mind up, so there's not much point in me replying anyway. Have you had many responses? Do you know?
Yes.
We have, yeah.
Yeah.
There's been a big reaction both before and after the consultation on this, as you would expect.
So if they were almost universally negative, that could change people's minds, or is it just a question of analysing those responses?
I think it's a question of analysing those responses.
Yeah, we have asked specific questions that we've asked people to answer to help us build the kind of evidence base. So we've obviously presented an evidence base in relation to what we've received from STV, but also in relation to things like our own audience research. So there's a lot of content in that consultation that flows from Ofcom's engagement with audiences across Scotland, which we do kind of qualitatively and quantitatively every year as part of things like our Media Nations work. And what we've asked consultees to do is to come back to us on the specific questions about what's being proposed here with evidence as to why we should do a particular thing. And we'll be doing that analysis after the consultation.
Well, I mean, certainly from I'm sorry to cut in, but we've obviously short of time. I appreciate that, but virtually everybody that we've heard from, and I think colleagues will probably say the same, whether it's bar STV management, but certainly journalists, former people with STV, and audience, audience members, watchers are opposed to this. And I think their feeling is it is a diminution of service. Would you suggest that the service that is going to be provided is as good as what it was before?
Yes, quality-wise, yes, we do. And that's fundamental to the decision. This is still going to be a high-quality form of regional news available for audiences on linear for viewers across Scotland. It's going to look and feel a bit different, but it's still going to be high-quality regional news.
But there are going to be people who are going to miss out, and there's certainly going to be local news that isn't going to be able to be covered in the same ways that people have. I mean, we kept hearing about the audience. The audience aren't one one group. I mean, certainly in an area like mine, the Highlands and Islands, it's really vitally important we have news as local as possible. And that's why there's such high listening numbers for kind of local radio. And I think what's happening here is what happens with a lot of the kind of older people who's been highlighted, I think, by the convener, are going to see a reduction in the service they're getting. Would you accept that?
I think the word used was a dilution of it. It'll look and feel different. There might not be as much in any half hour at 6 o'clock than there has been previously, but over the totality of what STV is doing, we hope this gives them the flexibility to serve audiences increasingly in digital spaces on top of a really high quality linear news programme.
I mean, also, sometimes I think you get stories on the two different programmes, which are in a sense the same story, but they're done by two different people from two different places. So I think it's really important that and this is STV's responsibility, that high quality local journalism is still kept on that programme.
I mean, the point was made, I think, by perhaps Glenn, that STV have said they're committed to journalism, local journalism, and covering those kind of local issues. But they signed a licence which made obligations pretty much a year ago, and that's already being changed. So how can we have any real faith in those obligations when they can just come to you and say, well, actually, I'm sorry, it's going to be too difficult, too expensive?
Well, there isn't anything to actually stop that. With all these licences, as Glenn explained, there is they can hand them back.
So
anyone
this
can
might
hand
be,
them back.
but they're not handing back the licence. What they've come to you.
No,
and
they've
said,
asked for a variation. Rather than handing back, they've asked for a licence variation.
So what's to stop them coming for another variation when things are a little bit too difficult, too expensive next time?
Nothing to stop.
So this
them, no.
might not be the end of the variations of the licences.
The BBC comes to us with variations of the licence probably about every 3 months. So I imagine that will continue. There is nothing in the current legislation to stop them coming back to us another licence variation. No, but we take each licence variation separately and give it equal scrutiny.
Okay, I'm conscious of time, so I'll hand over to Mr. Harvey.
Thank you, Convener. As I've said in previous occasions, I strongly share the concerns that have been expressed by members about STV, but we also have the inquiry into broadcasting, and we're now left with very few minutes to explore some of those issues. I might suggest after the session that we follow up in writing with some additional questions on that. In the time available, could I ask you to respond to the suggestion that we are all, parliaments, government, regulator, industry, we are all having far too narrow a conversation at the moment about how the regulation of our media landscape needs to change. And the reason I suggest that is we're talking about whether or how to continue or to adjust arrangements which have their origins in a time when public service broadcasting was utterly dominant in the media landscape. It set the tone and the agenda for the rest of the industry. It set audience expectations profoundly. It shaped the media landscape in a way that is no longer true. And the public service broadcasters remain very important, but they are players within a much wider landscape, some of which is, frankly, the Wild West, and which is much less significantly regulated. We're moving into an era, as you've said to others, where some of those public service broadcasters will be specifically trying to put their content onto completely unregulated platforms. Their content may be produced in a regulated way, but it will be completely intermingled with opinion presented as fact, conspiracy theories, extremist content, AI slop, rage bait, AI-generated images, which, although it seems that the rules on intimate images being created are going to be enforced now, we don't have any similar rules on the use of AI to propagate conspiracy theories, to damage people's reputations, to manipulate share prices, to affect election results. And public service broadcasters' content will be entirely intermingled with all of that wider content in every sense. So the regulatory arrangements which were designed to ensure that people have a media landscape they can broadly trust will remain utterly ineffective. So can I ask you to respond to that suggestion?
I
that
actually
we
quite
need
agree
a
with
much
quite a lot what you
broader
said.
approach to regulation of the
Yeah,
media
I actually
landscape?
agree. I agree quite considerably with what you said. I think having a narrow conversation is not a good idea. In fact, when we published our report into the public service broadcasting sector, we did actually call for a review of regulation, and we've actually put out a consultation at the moment, asking people to input into what that should change. Some of it is within our gift, some of it isn't, will require legislative change. We are in the process. In fact, yesterday we published our proposals for prominence of social media on smart TVs, as per the Media Act, that gives us that for the first time will guarantee, if it all goes through, and our minds are not made up, of course, on these things, but if it goes through and we land on it, for the first time when you turn on your Samsung telly or whatever, there will be the absolute right, for no money at all, for the public service broadcasting apps to be on the first rail that you land at. Now, of course, prominence on smart TVs, yes, that's something that's coming in, but how do you do prominence of good, quality, trusted, regulated news in the soup, if you like, of the internet, on that, exactly. So in our report, and we are just in discussions with this now, we're focusing on the video sharing platforms. We've chosen to go focus particularly on YouTube, because we think it's being used in the sitting rooms more, and it is the place where increasingly people are turning to. So we're in discussions with DCMS and with stakeholders about what would prominence look like on YouTube. We don't have all the answers. We need people input into that. We did nod to, can you give prominence to PSBs on a whole range of social media? And I don't have the answer to that. And anyone who does, please come and talk to us. But it is, because they're all so different. But we do recognise, and government recognises, the importance of making sure that the good quality, trusted, regulated content that people know they can trust, whether it's BBC, whether it's STV, is discoverable. But allied with that, and because they're all different algorithms and different systems, allied with that, and I feel really strongly about this, and I'm really pleased that the Scottish Government in particular has made moves here, what they call media literacy, I prefer to call critical thinking and digital citizenship, knowing the difference between the slop and the good stuff, knowing that, and our research does show this. If you ask young people, how do you verify what you see on TikTok, whatever, they will quite often say, well, I'll go and check it out on the BBC, or I'll go and check it out on STV. But that media literacy, I think, is really, really key to addressing some of those issues. But you're absolutely right. We need to have a much wider discussion about what does regulation look like for this kind of content. Forget broadcast, call it, it's the content, certain types of content. How do we regulate them in the world that we're living in now, and may increasingly be doing so in the future? So it is discussions that we're having, and I think in the next, we will be, as I said, we've done a call for evidence. Some of it is within our control, some of it requires government legislation.
That suggestion about media literacy in the broader sense, however we frame that, is important, and I agree
Hugely.
with
and it's not just kids, it's
I
all
agree
of
with
us.
the value that it can have, but it is only one element of the protection. If we think about it almost in a public health sense, that is about individual choices to wear a mask in public or something like that. But if those were the only protections that we had in place for a public health emergency, we would utterly fail. And if public service broadcasters' content is discoverable on a platform which is still riddled with all of the evils I described earlier, that doesn't actually help. Surely what we need is for those platforms themselves to be regulated if we want to achieve what previous generations achieved in a media landscape that is broadly trustable, rather than one on which you can seek out and find trustworthy content.
Yeah, who comes under what regulatory remit is a discussion for governments, because it requires legislation.
I think, I would maybe make one additional point, which is, I think we touched on this when we were at the committee in May last year, Mr Harvey, where I think the convener asked us in broad terms about our duties under the Online Safety Act. So they are relevant to the answer to your question. But I think what you've said is very, very fair about whether or not we need to go further on all of this. And we know that both the UK and Scottish governments have been actively considering whether they need to legislate to create that type of framework that you've just described.
Okay, thank you.
Squeeze in a final question, sorry. You mentioned, Christina, that you know this would be better for the whole of Scotland and that you were looking at the whole of Scotland. But should this not just have been about the people of the North East and the impact on that licence? Because you seem to have, as Mr Kerr said, sort of homogenised them in a way you wouldn't do with, say, Newcastle and Birmingham.
Of Cornwall to be getting their news that's made for them in London, quite rightly. No, sorry, maybe I misspoke when I said, when I talked about for the people of all of Scotland, I was talking about making sure that STV is sustainable and able to exist in order, and not just survive but to thrive is where I made reference to that.
Okay.
Can I just add one other thing? It's important to say this is not a licence for the North East. It's a licence for the north of Scotland in its entirety. So, I mean, anecdotally, we had an interesting conversation with a stakeholder a couple of weeks back with our online safety hat on, who said to us they felt that the North News was too Aberdeen-centric, was what they actually said to us. Now, that was their view, but I think it's an interesting anecdotal point that these are the types of things that we have to think about with this licence, and what we mean by distinctiveness might feel different in Inverness.
Is what I would say to that. I'm really sorry, we're right up against time. There may be questions that the committee want to come back to, and I apologise, we've been very tight for time this morning. But thank you for your attendance at committee, and on that note, I'll close committee for today.
Thank you very much.